On the night of December 11th, 1988, a 38-year-old woman named Françoise Gendron touched up her lipstick in the bathroom mirror of a nightclub in the city of Tours, France. Her best friend, Sylvie Riverigo, was washing her hands at the sink right next to her. Françoise and Sylvie were best friends. They had basically known each other forever, since they were just little kids. And these days, they went out together almost every single night. They were both divorced, and Françoise's 19-year-old son had recently moved out of the house, so she was making the most of her new freedom and staying out late all the time, often with Sylvie. Now, Françoise and Sylvie were not exactly the same in terms of, their attitude towards life. Françoise had always been much more sociable and had this huge circle of friends, and so really she was the one who often had to push her much more introverted friend Sylvie to come out with her, but she usually did. However, tonight, it was Françoise who turned to Sylvie and said that she actually wanted to go home now. She told Sylvie that the men they were there with at the club, Michel and Luc, were making her feel uncomfortable, and she wanted to leave. Now, it was clear to Françoise pretty much immediately that Sylvie was pretty disappointed. Despite being introverted, now that they were out, Sylvie wanted to stay out. And also, they regularly went out with Michel and Luc, and there was never any issues before, and so she said as much to Françoise, like, what do you mean? Like, what's the issue? But Françoise just said she was getting a weird vibe from both of them and just would feel better if she went home. And so a few minutes later, Françoise and Sylvie walked back to the table where Michel and Luc were still sitting, and there was a receipt on the table, and Michel was putting his wallet away, like he had just paid for it. And actually, Michel, he turned to the women and he said, hey, are you guys ready to leave and go to the next club? But Françoise, she just kind of smiled and grabbed her coat and said that actually she was going to leave now. She said she had to get home to her boyfriend, who was probably already at her apartment and waiting for her. The men were pretty surprised by this, and maybe even a little bit offended. And Michel actually asked Françoise, like, hey, are you sure everything's okay here? Like, is that really the reason you're leaving? And Françoise just said, yep, everything's fine. I just gotta go. But she could definitely tell that the men did not believe her. But Françoise didn't really care. At this point, she really just wanted to leave. And so she just turned and gave Sylvie a hug and then just said bye to the group who were just kind of sitting there somewhat stunned this is happening so quickly. And then Françoise turned and she hustled right out of the club and flagged down a cab before any of them could follow her. The next morning, Françoise woke up in her own bed to the sound of her boyfriend, Yves Martin, bustling around her bedroom and getting dressed. She rolled over to look at her alarm clock and saw that it was 8 a.m. Françoise sat up, and Yves turned to her and said good morning, but she immediately noticed that his voice was cold. And she knew why. The night before, when she had come home, they had gotten into a big argument because, he had been waiting for her for quite a while, for hours, by the time she finally got there. That was the reason she had to leave, and it really had upset him. And in many ways, this was not like a one-off issue in their relationship. It was a recurring one. Françoise was always staying out super late with her friends, and often with her male friends, and Yves felt like she was basically prioritizing all of them over him. He worked during the day, so the evenings were really the only time that he and Françoise could reasonably get together, but Françoise never seemed to get home until super late, and at that point it was too late for Yves to come over, or vice versa, and so they just didn't get to see each other as much as they could be. And so now, Françoise knew she had to do something to try to smooth things over with her boyfriend. So she turned to Yves and said, hey, do you want to come over tonight after you get off work? And she promised she would actually be home when he got there so they could cook dinner together and just spend some time together. It would be just a night for them. And at that, Françoise saw Yves' shoulders immediately relax. And then he turned around and he smiled at her and said, you know what? I'd really, really like that. And so at this point, the mood in the room completely shifted. They were sort of back on good terms. And so as Yves finished getting dressed, he asked Françoise what else she had going on that day. And she told him that she had a handyman she knew named Christian Moreau who was coming by that morning to put up new wallpaper in the apartment. So she'd very likely be stuck at home for most of the day while he worked on it. The two chatted for a bit longer, and then once Yves was ready to leave, Françoise kissed him goodbye, and then after he left, Françoise pulled herself out of bed and put on a robe. And then she went into the kitchen and she opened up a can of food for her cat, and then she made herself some coffee. She was a bit hungover from the night before, and she thought maybe a warm bath would make her feel better. So after she drank her coffee, she ran a bath, she got into the water, and she closed her eyes. At 11 a.m. the next morning, so December 13th, a janitor at the Trousseau Hospital in Tours, France, was carrying a trash bag out to the dumpster when he noticed something odd. There were 2 blue trash bags just sitting out on a strip of grass in the middle of the hospital's parking lot. Now, the trash bags they used at the hospital were gray, so the janitor knew these blue bags, had to have been left there by someone from outside of the hospital. So the janitor walked over to the bags and sort of inspected them from the outside, and they were sort of bulky, but you couldn't really tell what was inside of them. And then he just reached down and he opened one of them, and when he saw what was inside, he immediately stumbled back, turned, and ran inside, shouting for someone to call the police. About an hour later, so just before noon on December 13th, 1988, Chief Inspector Francois Barbier of the Tours Police Department walked across the parking lot of the Trousseau Hospital. He'd been sent out here to investigate human remains that had been found outside of the hospital, and he was the first officer to arrive on the scene, and so now a janitor was walking with him to show him the way to where the remains had been found. They walked over to a grassy strip in the middle of the parking lot, and they stopped next to a pair of blue trash bags. Inspector Barbier knelt down and he opened up one of the bags, and inside, he saw very clearly there were 2 severed arms and the lower part of 2 legs. He opened up the other blue bag and he found it contained a woman's torso, but there was no pelvis, no thighs, and no head. Barbier turned to the janitor, who he knew had found the remains, and he asked him, when did you find this? And the janitor said that he had been out doing his rounds, throwing his own trash away around 11 a.m., and that's when he had seen them. But they definitely had not been there when he had done his rounds at 9 a.m. that day. So clearly these had to have been dropped off sometime between 9 and 11. Barbier stood up and looked around, and he noticed there actually was a medical school right down the street. And for a second, he wondered if maybe this was all just a tasteless prank by some of the students who could have maybe stolen a cadaver from the hospital's morgue and dropped it here. But as he thought about it, he just couldn't imagine medical students desecrating a human body like that. I mean, even as a prank, it just seemed not possible. And so to him, it just seemed like the more obvious answer here, albeit a gruesome one, was that this woman contained in these 2 bags had been murdered, and whoever killed her chopped her body up and put them in these bags because it would be easier to dispose of her body that way. And so Barbier hoped that when the forensics team showed up, they'd be able to find fingerprints from the killer on the blue trash bags. Because at this point, they didn't have a head of this woman. The victim didn't have a head. And so it could be very challenging to identify who it was. And if you didn't know who the victim was, it would be even harder to narrow down who might have killed her. 4 days later, on the afternoon of December 17th, Barbier was reading over an autopsy report at his desk. After the initial discovery of those blue trash bags at the hospital, more body parts from what appeared to be the same body had been found dumped behind a clothing store in a commercial part of town. But the head was still missing. And with no clues as to who the victim was, the investigation really was just barely crawling along. The police had put out a press release about the body's discovery, but so far no one had come forward with information, and there had been no women who had been reported missing in the area recently. Also, no usable fingerprints had been found on the trash bags, and so at this point, they really just didn't have forensic evidence, and so they were not able to even begin to track down who the killer was or what happened to them. And now, as Barbier continued to read through this autopsy report, he saw that the medical examiner had run the victim's fingerprints through the database, but there was no match. And so again, there's just no leads in this case so far. However, as Barbier continued reading through this report, he saw that the autopsy did reveal that the victim had died recently, probably only 1 day before her remains were discovered. She appeared to have bled to death from 2 deep gashes on her wrists, and there were also traces of an anti-anxiety medicine that was in her blood, which suggested she might have been drugged before she was killed. And Barbier was sort of baffled by this, because the method of murder almost seemed gentle and controlled compared to the extreme violence that was done to the body post-mortem. Those 2 things were totally in contrast with each other. And so he wondered if this was all done this way out of necessity. And so maybe the killer was just too small or too weak, or maybe both, to kill the victim without sedating her first. And then also, along those same lines, maybe they couldn't move her body without chopping it up first. And so as Barbier is just sort of thinking through what could have happened here, the phone on his desk rang. He put down the report and he picked up the phone, and it was a woman who said that she had just seen a newspaper article about the dead body, and she thought it could be a woman named Françoise Gendron, who lived in an apartment complex called La Vallée Violette. And so Barbier immediately sat up, he grabbed his pen, and he wrote down the name and the address. But before he could ask who the caller was or why she thought the victim could be this woman Francoise, the caller hung up. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. Are you so used to keeping everyone else comfortable that you barely notice how often you abandon yourself in the process? I think a lot of us have been there. You get so used to putting everyone else first that taking care of yourself almost starts to feel selfish. And after a while, putting other people first stops feeling like a choice. Until one day, you realize you can't remember the last time a decision genuinely felt like your own. And the strange thing about constantly managing other people's comfort is that slowly you lose touch with your own. And this is where therapy can help you understand where those patterns come from. And it can help you rebuild trust in your own voice, your own instincts, and the parts of yourself that get pushed aside just to keep everybody else comfortable. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. Take the quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist quickly. BetterHelp has served over 6 million people globally. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen and get 10% off your first month of therapy. Half an hour later, Barbier walked through the hallway on the first floor of the La Vallée Violette apartment complex, where his mystery caller had told him his victim lived. This was the first lead he had gotten since the body was found, so he was hopeful that something would come of it. Now, the woman who called didn't actually give the apartment number for Francoise, just that she lived in this complex. And so Barbier just literally walked down the hallway and knocked on an apartment door at random. And the man who answered, Barbier asked him if he knew a woman named Francoise Gendron and did she live here? And the man just nodded and said, yep, she lives here. And then he pointed to a door right down the same hallway. And then the man, unprompted, told Barbier that he hadn't seen anybody go in or out of that apartment for at least a few days, and he was starting to get worried about Francoise's cat. Barbier's heart began to race, because if Francoise really did live in that apartment, and she really hadn't been around in days, well, it seemed very possible that she was his victim. So he thanked the man and said he would handle it, and then he walked down the hallway to the door, and he knocked. And there was no answer. But he could hear a cat meowing inside. And so at this point, Barbier was feeling really confident about the anonymous tip. And so he just turned and hurried back out to his car, and he radioed for a forensics team to come to this apartment complex. And then a few minutes later, they arrived carrying a battering ram to break down the door. And so Barbier and the team, they go back down the hallway to Francoise's door. Barbier got out of the way, and then the officers smashed it down with this ram. And then once it was open, Barbier stepped inside the apartment. As soon as Barbier was in this apartment, he was standing in the living room, and he looked around and nothing seemed disturbed. However, when he left the living room and went into the kitchen, it was a different story. Now, the kitchen was not a total disaster, but there was a broken dish on the ground and some food items that must have been on the dish at some point that also were scattered across the floor. And so just at first glance, it appeared like maybe some sort of struggle happened in here. However, Barbier looked around the kitchen and he didn't find any blood anywhere, so it was just this broken plate. And then when Barbier checked the rest of the apartment, no drawers or closets looked like they'd been ransacked, so this didn't appear like an apartment that had been robbed at any point. However, one thing Barbier did notice was in the bedroom, there were a few unopened rolls of wallpaper on a stool, like as if somebody had been about to do some work in the bedroom, but then just didn't. Barbier told the forensics team to first make sure the cat got fed, because there was a cat in here, and the cat was, a little malnourished, but basically okay. And then to sweep the apartment for fingerprints to see whether Francoise's prints matched the victim. And if she was the victim, he was hoping they might also find fingerprints or blood inside the apartment from whoever might have killed her. And so the forensics team, they got to work, and Barbier, he just continued sort of walking around the apartment, looking at photos that were out on display to maybe get a sense of Francoise's body size, to sort of mentally compare it to the victim's body. And as he was doing this, he happened to glance out the window and he saw a young man standing on the sidewalk outside who clearly was watching the police through the glass. And when Barbier locked eyes with this guy, the guy suddenly looked terrified and he just turned and began speed walking away, at which point Barbier opened up the window and shouted at this guy to stay right where he was. An hour later, Inspector Barbier walked into an interview room at the Tours police station and sat down across from the young man who had been watching Francoise's apartment. By now, he knew this man's name was Yves Martin, and he claimed to have been Francoise's boyfriend. And so Barbier sits down and he asks Yves, what were you doing outside of Francoise's apartment when I saw you? And Yves said that he had just come by the apartment to see if Francoise was home, but he got there and saw police inside and he knew something was wrong. But he specified that he hadn't seen or heard from her in about 5 days and didn't know she was missing, the last time he spoke to her was the morning of December 12th. Now, the instant Yves said December 12th, Barbier thought of two things. One is that was actually the day before the body was found in the parking lot, and two, based on the autopsy report, it was presumed that the victim was killed the day before her body was found, so December 12th. And so it's pretty suspicious that this guy is mentioning December 12th as the last time he saw Francoise. And so Barbier leaned in and he asked Yves to elaborate about the last time he saw Francoise on the 12th. And Yves said he had seen Francoise at her own apartment when he left the apartment around 8 a.m. on the 12th, and the two of them had made plans to meet up again at her place that evening. But he said when he got there that night, she wasn't home. But this was not unusual for her. So Yves explained that he just let himself inside her apartment with the spare key she had given him, and he just made himself dinner and he watched TV while he waited for her to eventually show up. And then he said at around 8 p.m., her landline, her home landline phone began to ring. Yves said that he answered the phone, which was not totally unusual, and he said the person who was calling claimed to be one of Francoise's friends. Yves said he didn't recognize the voice, but he said Francoise had a big circle of friends and he for sure did not know all of them. But Yves told Barbier that this caller was not calling the apartment to try to reach Francoise. They were calling the apartment to reach him, Yves, to tell him that apparently Francoise had decided to go out of town this weekend with some other friends and that she would not be home tonight. And Yves said this was not the first time that Francoise had ditched him. And so in his frustration after being told this by this friend, he said he grabbed his dinner plate and just chucked it on the floor and shattered it, and then he left. Barbier was surprised to hear this, and he was thinking if Yves was the type of person who would immediately start breaking things over something that, didn't seem like that big of a deal, well, what else was he capable of? However, as potentially suspicious as Yves was, Barbier had not actually confirmed whether Francoise was even his victim. This could just be a coincidence here, that she left town right before this body was found. She could be just fine. And so before Barbier let Yves go, because he couldn't really hold him at this point, he asked Yves to just give him a detailed account of what else he had done on December 12th. He wanted to get the full timeline of what he did on that day. And Yves just said after he had left Francoise's apartment that morning, when he and Francoise had made plans to meet up that night, he said he had spent most of the day at work, and then he had gone back to Francoise's apartment after work, and then after he had waited around for a while and got that phone call and broke the plate, he said he had just left and gone straight to his own apartment, which he shared with his mother, and he was there all night. And so Barbier wrote down what he said and made a note to follow up on his alibi. And then before he let Yves go, he just asked him if Francoise was planning to go anywhere or meet anybody on the day he last saw her. And Yves, he thought about it for a moment, and then he said, yeah, actually there was one thing Francoise had mentioned to him. She had told him that an acquaintance named Christian Moreau was supposed to come over her apartment later that morning to put up some new wallpaper in her apartment. The next morning, December 18th, Inspector Barbier knocked on the door of Christian's apartment, the guy who was going to put up the wallpaper. Now, at this point, forensics still had not confirmed whether or not Francoise was the victim, but for the time being, Barbier was working under the assumption that she was. A few seconds later, a young man answered the door and confirmed he was Christian Moreau. And so Barbier asked him if he remembered going to François Gendron's apartment on December 12th. And Christian said yes, he did remember, but he seemed confused about why he was being asked about it by a police officer. Barbier explained that Francoise was presumed to be missing and had even been possibly killed on the same day that Christian was at her apartment. And Christian looked very surprised to hear this. And he just said, I was there on the 12th. I got there around 10 a.m. that morning. Francoise seemed perfectly fine. She appeared to have just gotten out of the bath, and it just didn't seem like anything was wrong. However, Christian said he was only in the apartment around Francoise for like a minute because he just dropped off the new wallpaper and was going to install it on another day. So it was a very brief interaction, but again, she seemed fine during this very brief interaction. Barbier obviously had seen those rolls of new wallpaper just sitting in Francoise's apartment, so he figured this part of Christian's story had to be true, that he must have dropped them off. But it did seem a bit odd to drop the wallpaper off on one day and then come back at another time to actually perform the work. Like you could easily just do those two things at the same time. So he wondered whether this had actually been the plan all along, or if something unexpected had happened inside of the apartment with Francoise that had somehow stopped Christian from installing the wallpaper on that first visit. So Barbier asked Christian for his alibi for the rest of the day that Francoise had last been seen, which was the 12th. And Christian went over his entire day, he provided all the information, and then afterwards, Barbier, after taking down some notes, he said he would be in touch. Now at this moment, Barbier didn't have enough evidence to hold Christian for more questioning. But as he walked back to his car, Barbier hoped that forensics might find some fingerprints or blood in Francoise's apartment that could implicate Christian. A day later, Barbier sat down at his desk and read over a forensics report on Francoise's apartment. Now, there hadn't been any blood traces found, but a set of fingerprints had been pulled from the phone, and they matched the hands that had been found inside the blue trash bag. So this confirmed that Francoise was indeed the victim. But so far, there was no evidence pointing to who killed her. Yves, Francoise's boyfriend, his alibi checked out. And that handyman, Christian Moreau, he also had a solid alibi. And then as for Francoise's 19-year-old son, who was serving in the military, well, he was confirmed to have been at his barracks over 200 miles away at the time of the murder, and so he was ruled out as a suspect. And then also, he would say that he had not heard from his mother since several days before she was actually killed. Barbier was still trying to figure out who was that person who called Francoise's apartment when Yves was there, to tell Yves that, hey, your girlfriend's going to be out of town this weekend, because it just seemed like that was pretty suspicious, and this person who was calling must know something about Francoise's death. But this was the 1980s, so it was harder to get a hold of phone logs than it is today. Now, Barbier had submitted an order for those phone logs, but the order had to be signed by a judge still, and then it could also take several more days beyond that to actually get the records, and so there was a bit of a wait. However, just then, another officer knocked on Barbier's door and said that a phone call had just come in from someone claiming to have information about Francoise Gendron. And so Barbier, he picks up the phone and he hears a woman's voice, and this woman tells him that she has information on Francoise. And Barbier immediately wondered, like, is this the same anonymous woman who called in before with that tip that Francoise was the victim? But Barbier just couldn't quite tell if it was the same voice. And so this woman told Barbier that she had been a very close friend of Francoise's, and she knew about two men named Michel and Luc who might have been involved in Francoise's death. She said right before she died, Francoise had found out that these two men were secretly involved in drug trafficking, and apparently they had talked about killing Francoise if she reported them to the police. Specifically, the caller said these two men had threatened Francoise that they would drug her, bleed her out, chop her into pieces, and then cut off her head so she could never be identified. Early the next morning, so on December 20th, 1988, 7 days after Francoise's body was found, Chief Inspector Barbier pulled up outside of a discount store in a shopping area in Tours. In front of the store, there were two men unloading boxes from a semi-truck. Barbier, he got out of his car and he began walking towards them. And when these two men saw the detective approaching, they immediately seemed sort of panicked. And when Barbier got close enough, he asked them if they were the store's owners, Michel and Luc, and one of the men nodded. At which point Barbier said, "You two are coming with me." About an hour later, Barbier walked down the hallway at the police station, past the doors of the interrogation rooms where Michel and Luc were currently being held. But first, he wanted to speak to the third person the police had brought in for questioning that morning, Sylvie Reverigo, who happened to be Francoise's best friend and friends with Michel and Luc. And he sat down across from her and he basically said, look, like, we know you're connected to the two men, Michel and Luc, and also to Francoise, And we want to know if you know anything about these two guys, because apparently they could have been threatening Francoise. We think they could be involved. Tell me everything you know." And Sylvie would tell Barbier that she was actually scared of Michel and Luc, and that was why she had not come to police yet, because she was worried if she told them what she knew, they would hurt her. She told Barbier that those two men had told her, Sylvie, that they intended to kill Francoise because they were worried that Francoise was going to report them to police for drug trafficking and selling stolen cars. And Sylvie said she didn't know if they were actually capable of that, but she just was too worried about going to the police about it and feared they would find out and then she would become a target as well. And so he and Sylvie chatted for a bit longer, and he got some additional information about when exactly they spoke to her and said this, and some other details about sort of their demeanor and the people they hung out with. And then after that, Barbier got up, he left the interrogation room, and in the hallway, he caught up with the detective who had actually already begun interrogating Luc. And the detective said that so far, Luc had totally refused to cooperate, and he'd outright denied even knowing who Sylvie was. Barbier sighed when he heard this, and he had a feeling right away that Michel was not going to be any more cooperative. But he was going to try his best to crack him. So Barbier went into the room where Michel was being held, and after he sat down, he just asked Michel if he had seen the news about that woman who was found chopped up in trash bags in a hospital parking lot. And Michel said yes, he had heard about that. And then he made a joke that maybe a surgeon at the hospital had made a pretty bad mistake or something. Barbier didn't react to the joke, and instead he just pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. And then Michel, he opened it up, and what he saw were photos of those blue trash bags and also photos of the severed body parts that had been found inside of them. And when Michel saw these pictures, he went completely pale. Barbier then asked Michel, "Do you know who that body belonged to?" And Michel, he just looked up and shook his head and said no. Barbier just stared at Michel for a moment, sort of just gauging his reaction. And then eventually he said, well, the body belonged to Francoise Gendron. When Michel heard this, he really looked like he was in complete shock. But Barbier immediately followed up and said, "Michel, did you kill Francoise?" And Michel, his reaction was to immediately shout no, that Francoise was a great friend of his and he would never hurt her. Barbier was crazy for thinking he would do that. And then again and again, he just insisted that he was completely innocent here. Now, immediately, Barbier thought Michel's reaction here was pretty genuine. But just then, there was a knock on the door, and so Barbier, he got up and he stepped out into the hallway, and another officer told him that the forensics team had just found a piece of evidence that almost certainly would crack this case wide open. Based on forensic evidence and an eventual confession, this is what police believe happened to Francoise Gendron on the morning of December 12, 1988. Around 10 a.m., the killer knocked on the door of Francoise's apartment. Francoise answered the door wrapped in a towel and told the killer to come on inside. The killer stepped in and they acted very friendly and casual, as if this visit was nothing out of the ordinary. But after the two had chatted for a while, the killer decided it was time to put their plan into action. After all, Francoise was a problem for them, and they had to deal with her once and for all. So, at some point, the killer told Francoise that they had something they wanted to show her, and asked if she would come over to the killer's home just for a minute to show them. Francoise eventually agreed, and once she got dressed, the two of them headed out together. And so the two of them, they walk their way to the killer's home, they go inside, and then before the killer is going to show Francoise, what they brought them over here to show them, they first made them both a pot of tea. And critically, the killer crushed up a few anti-anxiety pills and put those in the bottom of Francoise's cup of tea. Then the killer brought the tea over to the kitchen table where Francoise was sitting, and the killer sat down with her, and they both drank their tea. The killer made sure Francoise drank her entire cup, but by the time Francoise had finished her tea, she was so sedated from the drugs that she could barely sit up. At this point, the killer knew they could move on to the next phase of their plan. And so the killer at this point lifted Francoise up out of the seat. She didn't put up a fight, and they carried her over to the bathroom, and they put her into the tub, and they turned on the water. And then eventually, when the water filled up high enough, the killer just pushed Francoise's head under the water, and again, Francoise, because of the drugs, couldn't do anything to stop it. And she remained under the water until she fell unconscious. After Francoise was dead, the killer simply drained the tub, and then cut Francoise's body into pieces to make it easier to dispose of. They took the pieces and shoved them into blue trash bags and then dumped them in the parking lot of a nearby hospital 10 minutes away. But the bigger problem for the killer was Francoise's head. The killer wanted to completely erase Francoise's identity. So, for that reason, they kept her head at their home. They would flush Francoise's teeth down the toilet, and they would take the other pieces of her head and they would throw them into a nearby river. However, despite all this effort, the killer forgot one thing, which was they put Francoise's hands in those blue trash bags, and so her body was identified by her fingerprints just a few days later. And then not long after that, a tip soon led the police right to the killer's door, and when they investigated the killer's home, they found crucial pieces of evidence in her bathroom. The killer was Francoise's own best friend, Sylvie Reverigo. Sylvie had always been sort of jealous of Francoise, primarily because she seemed happy all the time. And on top of that, Francoise got a lot of attention from men, which just, again, made Sylvie jealous. And since the two women, post-divorce, were spending so much time together, even more than in their childhood, their friendship had gotten suffocatingly close. And over this recent period of time where they were sort of on top of each other, Sylvie's jealousy and sort of resentment towards Francoise turned into full-blown hatred. Initially, Sylvie had tried to pin the murder on Michel and Luc by telling another friend of Francoise's, a woman named Yvette, that those two men had threatened to kill Francoise. And just as Sylvie had hoped, Yvette had called the police and passed along what she had said. But unbeknownst to Sylvie, Yvette also shared another tip with the investigators, which was that a few days after the murder, Yvette's own daughter had happened to go to Sylvie's house, and her daughter had found 2 gold dental crowns in the toilet. And the daughter and Yvette both knew that Francoise had gold dental crowns. So, by the time Sylvie was brought in for questioning, Inspector Barbier was already pretty sure she must have had something to do with Francoise's death. And so police would search Sylvie's home, and they would find traces of blood, and they would also find some of Francoise's jewelry hidden inside of a box. And then when Sylvie was confronted with all this evidence and testimony during her interrogation, Sylvie broke down and confessed. Sylvie Reverigo was charged with Francoise's murder on December 21st, 1988. 3 years later, she was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. On the morning of September 12, 2007, 20-year-old Ashley Wallace was in her dorm room at Bryant and Stratton College in Buffalo, New York, getting ready for her very first day of classes. And this was really exciting for her. I mean, she had just moved out on her own for the first time. It feels like she's an adult here. And so today was a big day. She looked herself in the mirror and made sure her look was just right. She gathered up all her books and her journals and all the stuff she would need. And then once she was ready, she began heading towards the door. But before she got there, she heard a knock on her door. And Ashley felt sort of confused, like she hadn't lived here long enough for people to actually know she lived here, so who would be coming to visit her? And she certainly didn't have any plans to see anybody today. And so she's thinking, like, I have no idea who could be at my door right now. So she walks to the door, she opens it up, and she is truly shocked now to see who's standing there. But her shock quickly turns into fear. So there were 2 police officers standing in the hallway looking right at Ashley, and the looks on their faces were very serious. Now, Ashley, the reason she felt so scared when she saw these police officers was not because she had, done something wrong. It was because in her life, before she got to college, she had experienced some pretty severe trauma. So her father had passed away when she was 13, a sudden heart attack, and it had been very traumatic for her. It sort of threw the family for a loop. And then her mother had remarried, and her stepfather, who had, raised her from that point on, he had sort of struggled with depression on and off, and it seemed like he was doing okay, but not long after her biological father had suddenly died, her stepfather took his own life. And so once again, Ashley and her family's lives were turned upside down. And so in many ways, Ashley had not really recovered from those 2 losses. Those happened not that long ago. And now she was out here on her own, trying to be an adult, trying her best to stay composed. But she just had this awful feeling when she saw these police officers that they were there to tell her that, somebody else close to her had died. But when the officers actually began speaking to Ashley, it was clear they were not here to notify her about, a new death. But they were here to talk about her family. They told her that they were there to speak to her about her father, her biological father, who had passed away 7 years earlier. And so when they said that to Ashley, she was like, okay, what do you mean? What do you want to know about my dad? And they told her that, Ashley, we exhumed your father. And it turns out he very likely did not die of a heart attack. We think he was murdered. About 30 minutes later, when these officers had finally left Ashley's room, Ashley was left feeling completely distraught. I mean, number one, she's just found out that there is suspicion that her father was killed by somebody, but worse than that was these two officers who had been here were not here to console Ashley. They were here to effectively interrogate her. They were looking into the family to see if, Ashley was involved in what happened to her father. And so for Ashley, this had really caught her off guard. She felt like she was stammering and confused in all of her answers, which only made her seem more suspicious. And it was like every little misstep she had, the police would dial in and ask even more pointed questions. And by the end of it, she was just sobbing and telling them, like, I didn't do this. I didn't hurt my dad. I have no idea who would do that. And so eventually the police had gotten up and left. But they told Ashley they were going to be in touch, and then they were gone. And so Ashley's just left there in her room, wondering what she's supposed to do now. She thought about, sucking it up and just going to class, but she's thinking, like, how can I possibly focus on class right now when I've just learned what I've learned and had this horrible experience with the police? And so Ashley ended up calling her mother, and her mother was obviously very upset when she picked up, even before Ashley said anything. And Ashley quickly learned that her mother also had a sort of similar experience with police that day, that she had also been told that, her husband apparently had been killed and they were now investigating her to see if maybe she had something to do with it. And so the two women just sort of cried on the phone and they began saying, like, I just don't understand, like, who would want to hurt him? It just doesn't make any sense. Like, they've got to be wrong. Like, none of this makes any sense. And so eventually Ashley's mother, whose name was Stacy, just told her daughter to come home, forget about classes. We can deal with that stuff later. Just come home, be with your family. Ashley agreed that was the most reasonable thing to do here. And so she grabbed her stuff, she left the dorm, hopped in her car, and she drove the hour back to her mom's place. And when she gets there and she goes inside, the first person she sees is actually her younger sister, Bree, who was 16 years old. And Bree's eyes were red. She obviously had been crying. And, in the first couple of seconds they spoke, it was clear that Bree, too, had had a sort of rough interaction with police as well that day. And so it's like the whole family has been thrust into this chaotic moment that none of them can make any sense of. On the one hand, it's like, who would want to hurt dad? But on the other, it's like, did this really happen? Is this a mistake? Like, why did they exhume his body in the first place? Like, what's going on here? There was just so much unknown. And so that afternoon, Ashley, her sister Bree, and their mom just retreated to their mother's kitchen. And there they mostly cried together and just sort of talked through this horrible situation. But eventually, later in the day, when the tears had sort of stopped flowing and reality had set in, that this was now a very complicated situation, if nothing else. I mean, basically, they were all under investigation for the potential murder of their father/husband, and they sort of didn't know what was going to happen next. But there was a lot of stress around, the next couple of days. They didn't know. And so under all this stress, Stacy, the mom, was like, you know what? I'm getting a drink. Do any of you guys want a drink? And Bree was only 16 and she declined. But Ashley said, sure. She was 20, not 21 yet, but she was drinking at this point, and so she said, yep, I'll take a drink. And so Stacy mixed some drinks for her and Ashley, as well as a non-alcoholic drink for Bree. And so for the rest of the night, the girls just sat in the kitchen having their drinks and trying hard not to let this horrible situation totally wreck them. The next morning, when Ashley woke up inside of her mother's house, she found she was really hungover. Now, she obviously had had some drinks the night before with her mom and her sister, but she was thinking to herself, like, the level of hungover she was feeling felt disproportionate. Like, she was really hungover despite a relatively small amount of alcohol. But Ashley was wondering if maybe part of the reason she felt so bad was not just a hangover. Maybe it was like this emotional fallout from this horrible thing that happened the day before. And so Ashley, she's laying in bed feeling so bad, and she's just convincing herself that I just need to get up, I need to go to my classes, I need to sort of treat the day like a normal day and sort of get my life back together and be ready to potentially deal with police or, whatever else is going to happen here. And so Ashley sort of wills herself out of bed. She's got a blinding headache. She feels horrible, but nonetheless, she takes a shower, she gets herself together, And before long, she's saying bye to her mom and sister, and she's driving back to the campus. And when she gets there, she still feels terrible, but, she goes to her classes, and she does her best to focus, which really turned out to be a gargantuan task, but she did it. And then finally, at the end of the day, during her last class, Ashley began to sort of break out of this fog, this hangover fog that she was in, and she began sort of feeling normal again. And so by the time she left the lecture hall and was done for the day, she actually felt good enough that she hopped right back in her car and drove right back to her mother's house. And that night, again, just like the night before, she, her sister, and her mom just sat in the kitchen, just sort of having this cathartic moment together, crying together, talking about their dad, sharing memories, sharing theories, and also having a few drinks. And again, Bree did not have any alcohol, but Ashley and her mother did. The next morning, when Ashley woke up, once again, her head was pounding. She was so hungover, way worse than the day before. Except when she opened her eyes and kind of looked around, that really was not the first thing that hit her. The first thing that hit her is, I don't know where I am. The room looked different. And as she kind of adjusted and looked around, she realized she was in a hospital room. And so Ashley began to panic and began looking around for her family or anybody she recognized, but nobody that she knew was in there. There were just these two police officers sitting against the wall in her room. And these two officers, when they saw Ashley coming to, they got up and they walked over to her and they explained to her that she was very lucky that her mother had actually found her in her bed at her mother's house that morning, and Ashley had been unresponsive. And so her mother had called an ambulance and they had rushed her here, and luckily she was stabilized now, but apparently she was very close to full-blown organ failure. Like, she almost died. It was very lucky she got here when she did. But before Ashley could ask any questions, like, well, what was it that was causing my body to shut down? Like, what's going on here? These two police officers kind of looked at each other, and then one of them pulled a piece of paper out of their pocket and they handed it to Ashley. And they said, you need to explain yourself. It would turn out the way Ashley's stepfather had taken his own life was by drinking antifreeze. At least that was the initial theory. But pretty quickly, investigators started to say, why would somebody take their own life that way? Drinking antifreeze is slow and painful. That's not a good first choice if you're gonna take your own life. And so as suspicions rose around the stepfather, investigators thought, okay, well, the biological father died just a few years before, and apparently he died of a heart attack, but maybe we ought to make sure, because we're basically suggesting that maybe somebody did this to the stepfather. Is it possible somebody, killed the biological father? And so they exhumed the biological father, and during the autopsy, they discovered antifreeze in his remains. And so now, fast forward to the hospital where Ashley has woken up. These officers have walked over to her, they've handed her a note and told her to explain herself. And this note was effectively a confession. The writer of this note said they killed Ashley's biological father, and then they also killed Ashley's stepfather. But now, because of the blood on their hands, they're going to take their own lives. So this was a suicide note / confession. And at the bottom of this note, it was signed by Ashley. Except Ashley did not kill her father or stepfather. Her mother did. Her mother used antifreeze to poison and kill both men, and then when police began poking around saying, what's going on here? We think somebody killed this guy and maybe him too. Well, what did Ashley's beloved mother do? She tried to poison her own daughter. She laced those alcoholic drinks they were having in her kitchen with all these painkillers to make it look like Ashley had taken her own life because she felt so guilty about murdering these two men. Except Ashley's mother called the ambulance a little bit too early the following day, feigning that she had just found her daughter unresponsive, because the ambulance, they showed up and first responders, they saved Ashley's life. Narrowly. Apparently, she was within 15 minutes of dying when she showed up at the hospital. Stacy was convicted of 2 murders, as well as the attempted murder of her daughter, and she was sentenced to 51 years in prison. However, she would die behind bars in 2016. Around lunchtime on March 31st, 2010, a man in his mid-50s named John Schmeier was sitting at a table with a bunch of his friends inside of a Hooters restaurant in the small city of York, Pennsylvania. So John was a retired eye doctor. He'd had a very successsual career, made a bunch of money, and his friends that were at this table with him were also, pretty successful guys, sort of like mid to upper tier professionals with very successful careers too. But what they were doing today had nothing to do with career. This was pure pleasure. This group of guys, this specific group of friends who were very, very close, they would meet up, a couple times a month at this particular Hooters. They would sit at the same table, they would order the same things. They loved it. It was sort of like their little clubhouse. And in fact, they had even come up with a name for, this group of friends. They called themselves the Orange Shorts Society. And so the reason they did that is because Hooters has a sort of vibe to it that if you've been there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you haven't been there, basically the waitresses dress in very scantily clad clothing, and they all wear these sort of iconic white tank tops and orange shorts. And so basically these men were sort of joking that they were the Orange Short Society because of the shorts these women would all wear. And so that afternoon, John and the rest of the members of the Orange Short Society all sat around chatting and, BSing with each other, just being guys. And at some point, John brought up a subject that the rest of the society was accustomed to him bringing up, and that was his ex-wife, Monica. So all of his friends knew that John had been married to Monica for 20 years, but then they got divorced in 2003, so 7 years earlier. But still, Monica was a thorn in John's side because he had to pay her alimony. And, he understood that that comes with the territory of divorce. It is what it is. But Monica had made the way John paid her the alimony really cumbersome. And John was convinced, as he would tell his buddies in the Orange Short Society, that it was totally intentional, that she had made it cumbersome. She wanted it to be hard. She didn't like John, and she was punishing him. And so what Monica did is she made John literally each week take cash out of an ATM, put it in an envelope, and then physically drive it to her house and drop it off. She would not accept payment any other way. And the reason she was able to do that is because she claimed she did not have a bank account, and she couldn't be forced to make a bank account. And so either John made these cumbersome payments in cash, or he risked not making the payment at all, and then she could come after him legally. And so he was sort of trapped, making this trek once a week to hand over cash to his ex-wife, who he really couldn't stand. Now, their divorce was not super contentious. The two of them just sort of drifted apart. They stopped seeing eye to eye. And actually, Monica really didn't like the whole Orange Short Society thing. She thought it was totally scummy and that John and his buddies were just kind of gross for going to that restaurant and sort of making jokes about, what these women are wearing and making that part of their identity, the Orange Short Society. She didn't like it. And so they just kind of drifted apart. That was all it was. But now it had become this sort of bitter feud between the two of them. And so at the same time that John and his buddies in the Orange Short Society are sitting in the restaurant and John is going on his tirade once again about Monica's alimony, simultaneously on the other side of town, police rushed to Monica's house. Minutes earlier, there had been a 911 call that came from Monica's house, but when the operator answered, there was no answer. And so by protocol, they had just sent first responders out to the house to see if whoever had called was okay. And so the police, they get to Monica's house, they park, they go right up to the front door, they're knocking on the door, there's no answer, they're looking around, there's no sign of forced entry, no sign of anything really going on here. It's just a quiet day in the neighborhood. But they go to the door again, they knock a few more times, and when there's no answer, they try the doorknob and it's unlocked. And so they open the door up, and right away they look in, and there's Monica. And she's dead on the ground with the phone right next to her, and she's been shot in the head. Shortly after this discovery, the lead detective, Douglas Demagon, along with his team, began to survey the crime scene. And they quickly found a purse next to Monica's body, and inside was her license. That was how they identified her. And then they also found a .32 caliber shell casing lying near the body that clearly seemed to be from the round that struck her in the head and killed her. But perhaps the most unusual aspect of this crime scene had really nothing to do with the body. It was all the money that they found all over the house, specifically cash in envelopes. There were these envelopes in trash cans and drawers on tables. I mean, it was kind of like all over the place, some out in the open, some hidden, but there was lots of money stashed in this home. And so Demagon and the other investigators, began to wonder if, okay, maybe this was a robbery and Monica got killed in the process. But it's like, okay, if it was a robbery, why is there so much cash out in the open, literally packaged up in envelopes, easy to, remove from the house? Why is it all here? It's almost like no cash was taken, or certainly not very much was taken, and also other valuables are still in place. It didn't have the feel of somebody ransacking the house. It just sort of felt like somebody came in here and killed Monica. Detective Demagon and his team searched the whole house, and they couldn't find any sign of forced entry. So basically, whoever came in here and did this either, just walked in because a door or window was unlocked, or maybe Monica let them in, maybe she knew who they were, or they had a key. Detective Demagon asked the forensics team to begin sweeping the house for DNA to see if maybe they could find something that could show them who had been here lately. And so while that team got started, Demagon continued to walk around the house, and he eventually found a Rolodex, which is basically like a big book full of phone numbers and addresses. And as the detective was flipping through that book, that was how he discovered that Monica had an ex-husband, John Schmeier. That evening, Detective Demagon and another investigator rolled up to John Schmeier's house. They walked up to the front door and they knocked, and then a moment later, the door opened, and John was standing there looking very surprised. So in homicide cases, generally speaking, the spouse or ex-spouse is always suspect number one. And so even though Demagon didn't really have any evidence linking John to the crime, he did have the fact that this was her ex-spouse, and so therefore, he is suspicious. Before John could ask any questions, Demagon and his partner introduced themselves and said they'd like to come in and speak to John. So John said, okay, come on in. So they walked inside, they sat down, and then once they were seated, Detective Demagon watched John very closely as he told him why they were there. Basically, your ex-wife has been murdered, and we're here to talk to you about it. Detective Demagon wanted to see if John would have a big reaction or maybe a subdued reaction. Whatever reaction he might have could be telling to how involved he maybe was or wasn't in this case. When Demagon told John that Monica had been shot to death, John's reaction was huge. His eyes went wide, he clutched at his chest like he was having a heart attack, and then he kind of leaned forward and began sobbing. But when he came back up again, the detective noticed there were no tears in John's eyes. It was just this sort of huge reaction, but Demagon couldn't really tell if it was genuine or not. He also didn't have a baseline for John. He didn't know if this was normal, but this seemed really dramatic, almost like he might be acting. So instead of trying to console John, Demagon just asked point blank, where were you earlier this afternoon at the time of the shooting? And when he asked this, John, who still was sort of rocking back and forth and grabbing his chest and acting very upset, he suddenly stopped, put his hands by his side, and just said, oh, I was at Hooters with my friends. A few days later, Detective Demagon went to the Hooters, where John and his friends would always meet up, and he asked the manager to see the security footage from the previous Wednesday, the day of the shooting. So by this point, Demagon had actually already interviewed all of the friends who had been at the Hooters with John, the so-called Orange Shorts Society, and he had asked them all about John. Like, had he really been there? What was he doing? What was he saying? And they all said John absolutely was there the whole time. Like, there's no way he could have left and done anything to Monica. He was here with us. I promise you he was here. Now, they would admit to the detective that, John did speak disparagingly about Monica. He would talk about how mad he was about her alimony, and he definitely didn't like her very much. But that was it. That was the extent of his hatred. Now, despite how convincingly these friends said John was there the whole time, he couldn't have done this, Demagon still needed proof. He needed to really see that John had been here when he said he was here. So John went to the manager, they pulled up the security footage from the previous Wednesday, and wouldn't you know it, there's John. He comes in, he sits down, he's with his buddies, and he is there the whole time, during the time that Monica was killed. And so at this point, Demagon did feel like it sort of was impossible that John actually went and killed Monica. But given the contention between them, John apparently really doesn't like Monica. He hates making these payments to her. Like, there's obvious friction that comes up at these Orange Short Society meetings all the time. Maybe it was possible that John, who was pretty well off, had a bunch of money, maybe he hired somebody to do his dirty work for him. maybe he hired a hitman. And so over the next week or so, Demagon and his team began exploring this hitman lead, and they found that John had been taking out a whole bunch of cash over the last several weeks. But it sort of lined up with how much cash he owed Monica in the form of alimony, and they knew he had to, per Monica's orders, deliver this alimony payment in cash to her in these envelopes, and they found all those envelopes of cash at Monica's house, and so it seemed like that was all he was doing, taking money out to give to Monica. And so John was basically Demagon's only suspect at this point, and there was basically no evidence against him. And so Demagon knew he really needed to look into other leads here, like the John lead kind of going nowhere. And so he and his team began looking into local gang activity and, crimes in the area. Could this have just been random or something completely unrelated? But after 3 months of looking for any connection anywhere in the area, there wasn't one, and the case kind of came to a stall. And so at this point, Demagon decided that the only thing he could do realistically was just kind of start over, go back to square one, and basically re-examine all the evidence all over again. And that included going back and looking at the security footage from the Hooters on that Wednesday when the Orange Shorts Society was there. And so Demagon, he sat down, he starts watching this tape over and over and over again. It's like the 1,000th time he's looked at this grainy footage, and suddenly something stands out to him. Something he missed all the other times he looked. And as he replayed the footage over and over again, he realized he now knew almost certainly what happened to Monica. It would turn out the footage of the Orange Short Society meeting did hold the secret to Monica's murder. John Schmeier did not kill his ex-wife, nor did he hire a hitman to do it. He really had nothing to do with her death. The only thing he did do is, at these Orange Short Society meetups, he would talk openly about how he didn't really like Monica. In particular, he resented the fact that she was making him deliver all this cash to her to pay his alimony payments. It just felt totally cumbersome. But that meant John, on a regular basis, was telling these men in the Orange Short Society that Monica was flush with cash. She was giving her tons of cash every single week. This woman has so much cash at her house. And eventually, one of the Orange Short Society members, a man named Tim Jacoby, decided, you know what? I'm going to go to Monica's house and I'm going to take that cash. Demagon had been operating under the assumption that all the men who were present on that Wednesday meetup at Hooters, the Orange Short Society, that was the totality of the group. Those were all the members. Because the way the men talked about their group was they all meet up every single time. Same group, same seats, same restaurant. And so Demagon assumed, okay, then it's the same people. This is it. This is the totality of the group. Everybody is accounted for. But no, on the day of the murder, one regular member of the Orange Short Society was not present. Tim Jacoby. And that is the discrepancy that Demagon caught when he watched that footage for the 1,000th time. He realized, wait a minute, there's another guy. I heard another guy's name, Tim Jacoby. He's not here. Police would later tie Tim to the crime scene with DNA evidence. They determined that Tim went to her house with the intention of robbing her, but when Monica fought back, he shot and killed her and then fled without taking any money. Tim was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. He is currently on death row in Pennsylvania. On the afternoon of June 29, 1934, a 37-year-old police officer named Captain Alan Falby pressed the throttle on his police motorcycle and sped down a street in El Paso, Texas. Captain Falby's motorcycle lights and sirens were on because he was chasing a speeding pickup truck down the road. But despite the fact that obviously Captain Falby was in pursuit of this person, they were not slowing down at all. So Captain Falby had been a police officer for 11 years, and he loved his job, he loved his motorcycle, and he hated when suspects got away. So he kept his hand on the throttle and kept chasing down the suspect, but suddenly the truck he was going after slammed on its brakes and swerved hard to the left. Falby tried to slow down, but it was too late. He slammed into the back of this truck, and then he and his bike went sliding across the asphalt for a few seconds, and the whole time, Falby is feeling his body getting totally scraped against the pavement, and the wind's getting knocked out of him. And then finally, when he came to a stop, he was splayed out in the middle of the road, and his motorcycle, his beloved motorcycle, was laying on top of him, pinning his legs under him. And this bike weighed like 500 pounds. And adding insult to injury here, as Falby is screaming out in pain because obviously horrible injuries have been sustained here, he looks down the road and he sees the truck he was chasing, who clearly knew he just wrecked behind them. They're not gonna stay and help. They just drove off protecting themselves. And so pretty quickly, Falby kind of assessed the situation he was in. He tried for a second to push this bike off of him, but not only could he not move it, but every time he moved it just a little bit, the weight would kind of come down even harder and a little bit more pointed on his legs, which were crushed, and he had this excruciating pain down there. And worse, he's looking underneath him and he's seeing this growing pool of blood. Clearly, he's sustained potentially life-threatening injuries here, and he's all alone. Like, there's nobody here to help him, and he's totally stuck. And so even though he began calling out for help, the reality was, if nobody came along soon, he was done for. And he found himself starting to panic. Luckily though, just then, 2 men from down the road came running up to Captain Falby. Apparently they had been sort of behind the captain and were watching him pursuing this truck, and they had actually seen the accident. And so they had pulled over and they were now running up to see if he was okay. And so right away, without even needing to ask Captain Falby what he needed, these 2 men saw the situation. The bike is pinned on top of the cop. And so together, these 2 men were able to lift this heavy motorcycle off of the captain's legs. And as soon as they did, all 3 of them looked, and they could clearly see, the reason there's all this blood all over the pavement. There was this huge gash in Captain Falby's leg right above his knee that was just pouring out blood. And Captain Falby, he saw that, and he was already starting to feel lightheaded from blood loss, but just seeing this huge wound was totally disorienting. Fortunately though, the 2 men who had arrived on the scene to help Captain Falby kept their composure. And one of them actually noticed that Captain Falby was wearing a necktie. He had a formal police uniform on that had, a necktie as part of it. And he gently reached over and he told Captain Falby to relax, and he undid his necktie. Meanwhile, the other man, he ran over to the side of the road where this big tree was, and he got a stick, a pretty sturdy stick. And so the guy who undid the necktie, he tied it around Captain Falby's leg above the wound, basically cutting off circulation to that wound, a tourniquet. He tied it off, and then the other guy came back over with the stick, and he handed it to the guy with the necktie, and he took the stick and threaded it carefully through the necktie that was now wrapped around the captain's leg, and he began twisting the stick, wrapping up the fabric as he twisted it, which in turn mechanically tightened that tourniquet around the captain's leg, much tighter than you could do, without something mechanical. Like, this is somebody who clearly knew how to make a real tourniquet out of sort of everyday materials. And so they tie off the super tight tourniquet, they stop the bleeding, and it ultimately saves Captain Falby's life. In fact, by the time Captain Falby actually got brought to the hospital and they took off this DIY tourniquet and patched him up for real, the doctor would tell Captain Falby that, he was about 10 minutes away from death from blood loss. So had it not been for those 2 guys who showed up and made that tourniquet, he very likely would have died. 4 years later, on December 12th, 1938, Captain Falby was back at work. And he had been, ever since maybe 6 months after his injury. He had just gone back to work, fully recovered. He did have some scar tissue on his leg, but he was basically back to full capacity. And so on this particular day, Captain Falby was on patrol like he normally was in El Paso when he got a call over the radio about a bad car accident that had happened out on Route 80, which is a major road in that town. And so Captain Falby races over to the scene and he sees there's this car that's clearly veered off the road and smashed into a tree, and the driver, or who appears to be the driver, is sitting still in the driver's seat and they were unconscious. And so Falby was the first on the scene. He pulls over, he gets off his bike, he rushes over to the car, and he carefully pulls this unconscious man out of the car and he lays him on the ground. And he sees this guy has a horrible gash in his leg and it's bleeding profusely. But because this basically mirrored the exact same type of injury that Falby himself had had 4 years earlier when he crashed his motorcycle, Falby knew what to do. He didn't have, a issued tourniquet on hand, but he knew how to make one. He had a necktie, and there were sticks on the side of the road. So as quick as he could, he rushed over, grabbed a sturdy stick, took off his necktie, tied it around this man's leg, used the stick to tighten it up even further, and he cut off the bleeding to that wound. And so at this point, now that Captain Falby has realized that, okay, this guy appears to be stable now, he's not actively bleeding, he's clearly still breathing, albeit unconscious, but, it seems like he has a fighting chance here. So he's waiting for paramedics to show up and take this guy to the hospital, and he's just sitting there sort of, happy he was able to be here and save this guy, when he sort of looks at this guy and he realizes something. The man he had just saved with his DIY tourniquet was literally the actual same guy who had saved Captain Falby with a DIY tourniquet 4 years earlier. Captain Falby had never even gotten the guy's name. They had not stayed in touch after his accident. They had gone separate ways. But now he's looking down at this man and he's realizing it's the same one. The guy's name was Alfred Smith, and he would make a full recovery. But when he was rushed to the hospital, they would say, you were within about maybe 10 minutes of bleeding to death had it not been for Captain Falby. So literally, this DIY tourniquet story played out almost exactly the same way with these two guys doing it to each other, but 4 years apart. Later on, Captain Falby and Alfred Smith would give an interview to Ripley's Believe It or Not to talk about the incredible coincidence that saved both their lives. And when the interviewer at some point congratulated Captain Falby on his heroic efforts, Falby simply stated, quote, "One good tourniquet deserves another."
You see, Alfred Smith was the man who put the tourniquet around my leg and saved my life when my motorcycle hit that truck. After all, one good tourniquet deserves another.
And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. When I left the military in 2017, I left carrying a lot of baggage that I didn't really know I had. But what I was doing is basically bottling it all up and then snapping at people left and right. And the worst part was that even though I didn't really see this happening or why it was happening, I knew my behavior was destroying relationships left and right. And it left me feeling very stuck and isolated. The people close to me eventually came to my aid and encouraged me to seek professional help, go see a therapist. And admittedly, I was pretty resistant at first. I felt like I, could handle my business on my own. But I did eventually relent, and I did see a therapist. And pretty quickly I saw, therapy can give me something that I really couldn't give myself. And that was a truly non-judgmental space to be heard and really talk openly about what was going on in my life. And my therapist gave me lots of perspective that I couldn't give myself, and they taught me methods to cope with my anger and my sadness, and it really kind of turned my life around. Healing is not linear, and you don't have to do it alone. So if you're struggling right now and you don't know who to turn to, consider giving therapy a try. And a great therapy option is BetterHelp. BetterHelp can connect you with a licensed therapist who will listen and help. Click the link in the description below or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen to get 10% off your first month of therapy. On the evening of December 16th, 1984, a 24-year-old electrical engineer named Hao Ran walked through the courtyard of a pretty low-rent, seedy apartment complex in Hong Kong. He held hands with his longtime girlfriend, 23-year-old Jen Yu. The pair had just finished having dinner together at Hao Ran's apartment, which was part of this complex, but now he was walking his girlfriend across this courtyard to the other side of this complex, where her apartment was located. And so Hao Ran always walked Yu home. The pair had been together for a few years now. They'd actually met in college after a close mutual friend had introduced them, and ever since then, they had been inseparable. And so Hao Ran was just sort of protective of Yu, and he felt like their neighborhood was not very safe, and so anytime, especially at night, when he knew his girlfriend would be sort of out and about in their neighborhood, he would walk with her to keep her safe. And so that's what he was doing tonight. Eventually, the couple reached the front door of the section of this complex that would lead up to Yu's apartment. And so the two walked in through the front door, and they made their way over to the building's elevator bank. There were 2 elevators. Hao Ran reached over and pressed the up button, and then he and Yu just stood there and waited. And as they waited, they began to hear the familiar sound of one of the old elevator cars clanging its way down the elevator shaft. These were old and creaky and really kind of sketchy elevator cars that both Hao Ran and Yu hated riding on. But Yu lived up on the 13th floor, and neither of them liked walking up that many steps, and so it was sort of like, the only other choice is to ride one of these elevator cars. And so eventually the car came down, the doors dinged, they opened up, and nobody was on the car, and so Hao Ran and Yu stepped inside. They pressed 13, The doors rattled to a close, and they slowly began going up. And the whole time they're going up, neither of them spoke. It was just kind of like anxious anticipation that, hopefully this car will make it all the way up to the 13th floor. And so as they're moving up, they're hearing the car banging into the walls, and it's just so uncomfortable. But eventually, they do reach the 13th floor, it dings, the doors open up, and both of them are so relieved when they step out of the car onto solid ground. And they make their way over to Yu's apartment, and the two, they give each other a hug and kiss and say they had a really nice time together. And then she retreats into her apartment, and Ron goes back down the hallway and presses the down button to go back down the elevator. And sure enough, a couple of seconds later, Ron heard the familiar sound of the elevator car shaking and banging against the shaft as it made its way up to him. There was a bell sound, the doors opened up, nobody was on the elevator car. Ron stepped inside, pressed the lobby button, turned around, and watched as the doors closed. And then slowly, he began to go down. And again, as he's going down, Ron had that same sort of nervous energy, hoping this elevator didn't come to a, lurching stop or something, that it just got him down to the ground safely. And so he's going down, it's floor 12, 11, 10, down he's going. And then at floor 7, the car came to a stop. But it was kind of a hard stop, not like emergency status hard, but it was a fairly hard stop at floor 7. And so Ron, he's instinctively thinking, okay, well, clearly someone on the 7th floor has called the elevator, and the doors are gonna open any second here, and someone's gonna get on. But as he's waiting for the doors to open to alleviate this sudden stress that, oh my God, is something wrong here? The doors don't open. And instead, the elevator suddenly lurches down another foot. It stops. But clearly, this is not normal elevator behavior. There is something wrong with this elevator. Like his worst fears are coming true, and the doors still are not opening. And so Ron's looking around wondering, what's he gonna do? What can he do? He's trying to tell himself that everything's okay. Maybe the doors still will open up, but they're not. And then he begins to smell something. It was almost like a sort of chemical smell. He couldn't really place what it was, and he's sort of looking around, wondering what's going on here, and his panic is rising, like this is a bad situation, has no idea what's happening, but clearly something bad is going on here. And then this already horrible situation gets 1,000 times worse, because he looks down and he sees the floor of the inside of the elevator is now on fire. And as he's realizing the floor is on fire, and that's what he was smelling, is like this burning smell, he sees his own legs are now on fire. And so in a completely panicked, fight or flight moment, Ron remembered that most elevator cars have an escape hatch somewhere, usually on the ceiling, and he looked up and he couldn't believe it. There it was. There was this escape hatch to get out of the car. And so right away, that's what Ron began trying to do. He kind of scaled the walls of this car. He punched open this hatch and he climbed out of the elevator, out of the fire, saving his own life. And so while all this chaos was happening in the elevator shaft, Ron's girlfriend, Yu, was in her apartment looking out the window. And her view was basically the same courtyard that she and Ron had walked across just, 5 minutes ago to get to her apartment building. And it was sort of customary that every time he would drop her off at her apartment, she would look out the window and wait for him to come out the front door, and she would watch him walk back across that same courtyard to his building on the other side. And so Yu sort of understood how long it would take, for Ron to come down the elevator and walk out the door. But now it had been, 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes, and he still hadn't come out the front door, and there really wasn't any reason for him not to have exited the building at this point. And she started to get worried. And so given the fact that Yu, much like Ron, was fearful that those old elevators in this building were eventually gonna get stuck while they were on them, given she had that fear, she instinctively was like, oh my gosh, maybe he's stuck in the elevator. That's why he hasn't left the building yet. And so instinctively, she left her apartment and walked down the hallway to the elevator bank, and she looked up above the doors, and it showed where the respective cars were located. And she saw that one of the cars was stuck at floor 7, and it wasn't moving up or down. It didn't matter if she pressed the button, that car would not go up or down. The other car would, but not that car. And so it convinced her that Ron has got to be trapped on that elevator car. He's stuck right there. I better call authorities. And so she did. She called the fire department and said, hey, my boyfriend, I believe he's trapped in the elevator. And so just a few minutes later, the local fire department showed up to the apartment complex, And they walked up to the 7th floor where they believed, this car was stuck. Now, they were not in some crazy, emergency mode running down the hall to open up this elevator car, because they're thinking, it's really just an inconvenience getting stuck on an elevator car. It's not like life and death. And so they just make their way up to the 7th floor by taking the stairs. And then on the 7th floor, they go over to the elevator bank where the 2 doors are to the respective elevator cars. And on the one that, shows the car is stuck on floor 7, it says the number right above the door. They use their tools to pry open the doors to see, the car right behind it. And once they pry it open, they do see the trapped elevator car, and it's not exactly where it's supposed to be. It's not sitting, right in front of the door. It's actually situated sort of below the 7th floor. They can basically only see the top of the elevator car. Like, this car has actually gotten stuck between the 7th floor and the 6th floor. But that in and of itself was not a huge thing. I mean, they could basically mechanically move this car up and down if they needed to, either up to the 7th or down to the 6th to get whoever was on the car out. What they noticed right away though, which was the way bigger problem, is they smelled and saw smoke, and it was coming from this elevator car, the trapped car. And so the firefighters immediately go into, okay, we gotta figure out where this fire is coming from. Is it coming from this elevator car? Is it somewhere down below at the bottom of the elevator shaft? Like, they don't know. But from their perspective, outside looking into the shaft, they could see that the hatch, the emergency hatch on this stopped elevator car was open, because they can see the roof of this car. And they're thinking, okay, maybe the trapped guy is right in there and we can look down, grab him, pull him out, and deal with this fire. And so they go in, they're yelling out Halron's name, and they look down into this elevator car. They're literally on top looking through this hatch, and they see the carpet inside of this car is all charred and burned, and there's some smoke sort of sitting inside the car. But there's nobody inside the car. It's empty, but they see there's blood all over the inside and up on the walls. And then they realize there's also blood kind of coming up, through this hatch, and it's on the top of the elevator car. Clearly, whoever was in this car was badly hurt as they exited out the roof. But now the firefighters are wondering, like, well, where did he go? Did he fall down to the bottom? I mean, because basically there's just these 2 elevator cars that move up and down inside of this singular shaft. There's basically nothing dividing the 2 shafts that these elevator cars move in. It's kind of like one big shaft. And so to the side of this frozen car is this huge shaft, multi-story shaft that goes all the way to the ground. And so they look over the edge and they shine their light down the elevator shaft because, the car on this side was up top. It was not obstructing their view. And sure enough, there is a man, maybe 1 floor down, who looks very badly injured. He's got cuts all over him, he's bleeding. It looked like his ankle was broken. And he was sort of huddled on this very small platform, basically 1 floor below. At every floor, when you walk onto the elevator, when those doors open up, there's like, a 1 foot long little platform that extends into the shaft just enough that it meets the entrance to the car. So when the car opens up, you walk across this little platform into the elevator, the door's shut and it goes up or down. But if you're in the elevator shaft, each floor basically has that little protrusion, that 1 foot, small platform. And there's the guy, presumably Halron, who is positioned, perched on the one right below them, on that little platform. And so of course the firefighters forget the fire, because that's a separate issue at this point, and they gotta go rescue Halron. And so they go down to the 6th floor, they open up the doors, they grab Halron, they pull him into the hallway where he is safe. He's obviously in an enormous amount of pain, he's been burned, he's got a broken ankle, he's in rough shape, but it appears like he's going to survive. And so as the firefighters placed Halron on a stretcher, and he's barely talking, he's very shaken up, he's just laying there. And so at this point, the girlfriend, she found out the firefighters had saved her boyfriend and he was on the 6th floor, and so she comes charging down the stairs, runs down the 6th floor hallway to be by her boyfriend's side, and she looks at Halron for the first time, and she just freezes. And she stares at him, and she says, "That's not my boyfriend." It would turn out this whole elevator disaster was highly coordinated, because what neither Halron nor his girlfriend Yu knew was that the same mutual friend who had actually introduced the 2 of them deeply regretted it. He himself was in love with Yu, and he couldn't bear to see her with another man. And so this mutual friend, whose name was Liu Wenjong, That night, he had secretly waited until he was sure Howron had climbed on the elevator car by himself, and then he had cut off electricity to that car, freezing it at the 7th floor, actually between the 7th and the 6th floor. And then he climbed on top of the elevator car, opened up the hatch just enough to pour kerosene into the car with Howron. That was the smell that Howron began to talk about and smell inside the shaft. Like, he clearly knew there was something off, but Howron didn't realize it was, this friend of his right above him. And then before Howron could even understand what was happening, Liu lit a match and threw it into the elevator car. That was what caused the big fire. But then, when Howron panicked and climbed up out of the hatch to save himself, Liu was waiting for him, and he stabbed Howron and then threw him off the roof of this elevator car, where he fell all the way down 7 floors to the bottom of the shaft, where he died. The man that was crouched on that platform, 1 floor below where this car was Liu. And basically what he did is, after murdering Howron, he leapt onto that platform from the top of this elevator car down onto that platform, sort of intentionally to hurt himself, to make it seem somehow like, he was just trying to help Howron, but then, basically fell and hurt himself too. Like, he didn't do anything wrong, but when they looked at Howron inside the shaft, he was clearly stabbed. Then also they knew this fire had been started on purpose. It was clearly arson. And so once all this evidence had piled up and it was pretty obvious that Liu had done it, he did confess, and he was ultimately sentenced to life in prison. One evening in February of 1966, a 34-year-old man named Jose Luis Peña walked down a staircase inside of a cafe in Madrid, Spain. At the bottom of the stairs was this sort of basement seating area. It was pretty quiet, only a few people were down there. But Jose Luis, as soon as he was down there, he saw his friend, Fernando Sesma, had already found a booth on the other end of the seating area, and he was beckoning Jose Luis over. And so Jose Luis, who had come here to meet Fernando, eagerly walked over towards him. And then before he even sat down, Fernando, who was grinning ear to ear, he held up this envelope and showed Jose Luis, like, I gotta tell you about this. So Jose Luis and Fernando were both members of a small club called Baleña Alegre, which means happy whale in Spanish, and their meetings were all about aliens and UFOs. Now, Fernando was actually a post office employee during the day, but at night, he was the de facto leader of this club, and he'd always been fascinated by aliens. As for Jose Luis, he actually was much more of a skeptic. He actually kind of actively did not believe in aliens, UFOs, or anything paranormal. But about a month prior, he'd had this sort of inexplicable, UFO sighting, or he didn't even know what it was. He was driving along and thought he saw something in the sky that didn't necessarily make him a believer. But he didn't know who to talk to about this thing he had seen. He couldn't make sense of it. And so that's how he had found his way into this group. It was just because it was an outlet to talk about this weird thing he had been through. And to be honest, he didn't know if he'd be staying any longer than maybe the next couple of weeks. He was just here for now. But regardless, Jose Luis and Fernando had made plans to meet up in this cafe tonight to sort of catch up on all things about the club before their actual club meeting that was going to happen maybe 30 minutes from when they were actually meeting. But as Jose Luis is sitting down, Fernando's got this envelope that he's really excited about. And once Jose Luis sits down, Fernando puts it in front of him and he's like, look, there's no return address. And he points, there's like this strange symbol on the outside of this envelope, and it just looks sort of foreign, like Jose Luis didn't really even know what he was looking at. But Fernando, who again is a full believer, he says to Jose Luis, he's like, I just got this letter and I'm gonna show it to the club tonight because I think it's from an alien. Now, when Jose Luis heard this, he was open to the idea of UFOs being a thing because again, he couldn't explain what happened to him, but he just felt like, give me a break. Like, what, an alien sent you a letter? Why? Why would they send you a letter? And he sort of said as much to Fernando, but Fernando, he was ready for this. Like, he knew Jose Luis was a skeptic, and he knew he would cut this letter apart. But Fernando, he took the envelope back, before Jose Luis could say anything more about how fake this was, and he pulled out the letter inside. And the letter, it was typed out, so it wasn't by hand, it was by typewriter. And the writer wrote that they were literally from an alien race called the Umites, and they had come from a planet called Umo. And they said that, the Umites had very advanced technology, and they'd actually already been living on Earth for the last 16 years. However, humans didn't recognize them because they sort of looked like normal people. And so this alien writer said, for all these years, they had been searching for, a true believer to share this secret with. And apparently, the believer they had found was Fernando. Now, Jose Luis could tell that Fernando was really excited, and so he sort of throttled back how much he sort of rained on his parade here, and he just let him have his moment and said, wow, that's really interesting. And then before long, the other members of their club came into this basement seating area inside this cafe. And as soon as they were all assembled, Fernando got up to the front of the room and he held up this envelope and he said, "You won't believe it. I got this letter. It's from an alien race. They want to talk to me. Like, can you believe this? We finally have proof. The aliens are here." And unbelievably, as he says this, Jose Luis is looking out to get the reaction of the other folks in the club to see how invested they are, in this new revelation. And Jose Luis can't believe it when others in this club begin reaching into their bags and pulling out identical looking envelopes with these strange symbols on them. And they're like, "We got these letters too. We just got them last night. We brought them here for this meeting. Can you believe it?" And so the whole meeting was completely dominated by, talks of the Umaite alien race and how, these letters have got to be legitimate. Like, this can't be a prank the way Jose Luis said it could be a prank. Like, this has got to be real. Who would want to prank us? We're just this little group that, investigates the paranormal. Like, why would anyone care about pranking us? And Jose Luis said to them, "That's why, because you believe in the paranormal and they're playing into that. Like, you're the perfect target to be pranked. That's why this is likely happening." But pretty much the entire club disagreed with Jose Luis, and they reminded him, Fernando in particular, that he should recall the club's motto, which was to believe everything until proven otherwise. Basically, the whole group was demanding that Jose Luis keep an open mind, because this might be the exact moment most of them were all waiting for. A little over a year later, in June of 1967, and Jose Luis was back inside of that basement seating area of that cafe in Madrid, Spain. To this point, Jose Luis had continued attending these meetings of the Balena Alegre. He had thought about leaving a couple of times, especially as this whole Umaite fervor had really took hold inside the club. He didn't buy it, but he had stuck it out and continued attending meetings. But on this particular day, he was here for a very specific reason. It was because he had seen an article in the local newspaper that he knew the club would be really eager to see. So at this point, Fernando actually was writing a weekly column in the newspaper about the Umaites, because shortly after getting that first letter and all the other members of the club getting those letters, he had written to the news, they had been really interested, and asked for weekly updates. And sure enough, over the past year, the club continued receiving these letters, Fernando included, from the Umaites, whoever they were, and he would write these update columns. And really by this point, a year later, that column had become really popular in Madrid. And so people of Madrid were pretty invested in the Umaites and, whatever was happening with them. And also adding to the intrigue was these letters were no longer just arriving on the doorsteps of Balena Alegre members. They were arriving in front of random people's homes all over Madrid. Like, random people were being contacted by, this alien race. Now, Jose Luis still very much believed that there is no way this could be real. Like, this can't actually be aliens. But the Umaites had basically become the only conversation topic in the club every time they met. Like, it was all they ever talked about. And it increasingly felt like it was a lot of what Madrid talked about. I mean, this was a big deal at the time. But today, the reason Jose Luis had brought the newspaper to bring to the group was actually because, they had published something that even to Jose Luis was pretty unbelievable. It wasn't an article that Fernando had published. It was not, another recounting of another letter showing up. It was actually, this newspaper themselves covering what appeared to be a local UFO sighting. And apparently somebody had captured a photo of this, presumed UFO, and that photo had been published in the news. And wouldn't you know, on the outside of this alien craft was that same strange symbol that adorned the front of all the Umaite letters that Fernando and the club members and all people of Madrid were getting from these Umaites. It was the same symbol. And so it sort of felt like, for the first time, it was not just, letters that could be fabricated and sent to the masses. It was like this vehicle that had shown up in Madrid that had that same symbol. Like, it had to be the Umites. Also, remember, it's 1967. And so faking photographs was very hard to do, at least, making something look convincing. And so that's why Jose Luis, he had brought this newspaper in to show the other members of this club, to be like, you know what, I gotta say, this is pretty unbelievable. And, the reaction from the club was equally amazed. They had all already seen this photo. I mean, they are completely locked in on all things Umites. And so this photo was sort of like the centerpiece of that day's discussion. And Jose Luis found himself sort of admitting that, this is pretty unbelievable and I don't know what to make of it. But by the end of the meeting, Jose Luis still cautioned the group, like, look, I know this looks so real and it feels so real. I mean, I'm bringing this to you. I think this is pretty unbelievable. But there's just gotta be an angle here. Somebody has to be faking this. Like, there isn't a way that some alien species is doing this. This just doesn't feel real to me. But at this point, it was like everybody shut him down. They're like, hey, you brought this to us today. You're the one saying this is hard to deny. Like, this makes it feel real. And so at this point, forget your dissenting opinion. What we need to do as a group is take the news of the Umites and this photograph and all the letters and not just show it to the rest of Spain, but we need to show it to the whole world. And so sure enough, after that, Fernando began going on TV and insisting the Umites were real, which actually did cause mass panic across all of Spain. People couldn't explain the thousands of letters and that UFO photo, and so belief in the Umites really caught on. And while Fernando and seemingly the entire general public of Spain became increasingly radicalized, Jose Luis grew more isolated from his friends in Balaena Alegre. And soon he quit attending meetings altogether. And then shortly after that, he began going on TV, but not to advocate for the belief in the Umites, but the opposite. To say, stop believing in this. There's no way this is real. But nobody really listened to him. The Umite story had really taken on a life of its own, and it was sort of beginning to spin out of control. A few years after the Umite letters began showing up and making headlines, two men had lied down on railroad tracks and basically taken their own lives by letting the train run them over. And police actually found notes in these men's pockets that just said, "The aliens call us." And given the timing of, their deaths, it seemed like it had to be connected to the Umites. Then, two Spanish sisters died in a murder-suicide, and police discovered they had been receiving Umite letters that might have contributed to this crime. By the 1970s, there were also multiple Umite-related cults operating in Spain, and one of those cults targeted young boys. And in the early 1970s, when Jose Luis's own son was 7 years old, that child was targeted by one of these cults to be brought in because of his father. Like, they were trying to bring this child in to be exposed to who knows what, just because of Jose Luis's public stature as it related to the Umites. Now, Jose Luis's son would not be pulled into that cult. He would be just fine. But for Jose Luis, this was pretty eye-opening and terrifying. The idea that his family could be targeted because of this Umite stuff was crazy. And so around that same time, Jose Luis stopped trying to tell people to not believe in this stuff and instead retreated from the public eye and just tried to live a quiet, isolated life. Over the next several decades, people all over Spain continued receiving Umite letters, and nobody knew why. And these cults that, sort of focused on the Umites continued to flourish and continued to believe that absolutely the Umites are real. As for Jose Luis, he really did try to live a private life away from all this craziness, but it was hard to escape it. I mean, he would see Fernando on the news all the time talking about the Umites, and he even published a book about it. I mean, it was kind of everywhere. But everything changed in 1996. 30 years after the first Umite letter was received. One night in 1996, people all over Spain gathered in front of their TVs very expectantly as there was going to be this special report about the Umites. And when the guest of honor, who was going to be a big part of this special report, came on screen and began talking about the Umites, it truly shocked the entire country. This person explained that in their own lives, they had recently had a near-death experience, and that experience had made them realize it was finally time to admit to the world that they had made the whole Umite thing up. It really was a hoax. They said they had written those first Umite letters and sent them to Balaena Alegre because they believed they would be susceptible to believing in the hoax. And they also said they really did fake that photograph that was put in the newspaper of the UFO with the strange symbol that matched the symbol on all those letters. But the person said, after that, they sort of had no intention to keep up the hoax. However, the story kind of took off, and all these copycats began sending their own Ummite letters to random people all over Spain, and then the news picked it up, and it was everywhere. And even though this person was trying so hard to literally tell the world that they faked this thing, nobody listened. The hoaxer was none other than Jose Luis. He literally had done this just to show the Balena Allegri how easy it was to get people to believe in aliens and conspiracies, because that's what people want. He basically wanted to show them that he was skeptical and he had this UFO experience and he was trying to get to the bottom of it, but everyone's like, oh, it's gotta be aliens. And it's like, no, let's step back and be rational. He was trying to prove a point that, look, I faked aliens writing to you and you all believed it. Like, how are we going to actually figure out what's real and what's not? But he wasn't expecting it to take on a life of its own. However, Jose Luis's confession never actually reached Fernando, because Fernando died years before Jose Luis admitted this really was a hoax. And so he died absolutely still believing that Ummites were real. And despite the fact there were at least 4 deaths linked to this Ummo craze, and also there were all these cults that were doing who knows what, probably illicit and illegal things, also tied to the Ummo hoax, despite all that, Jose Luis never faced any criminal charges. He died in 2014. One morning in the summer of 1876, a doctor named Louis Allard walked down the hallway of a hospital in Papeete, Tahiti. Tahiti is an island east of Australia. Louis was just about to step into his office when he heard the hospital doors open, and he looked over to see a few policemen walking in, carrying this unconscious man on a stretcher. Just from the looks of the way this guy was dressed, Dr. Allard could tell he was a sailor. So a lot of Dr. Allard's patients were sailors, because Papeete was a port town. So if people got sick or injured at sea and then docked in Papeete, they would come to the hospital right there. So Dr. Allard walked over to the police and asked them what was going on with the sailor. And the officers explained that this man's friends had found him unresponsive that morning, apparently after a very long night of drinking. Dr. Allard nodded and then motioned for the police to follow him and bring this guy with him, and he led them over to an exam room, where he had them lay out the sailor on a table so that Dr. Allard could look him over. The sailor appeared to be pretty young. He was in his 20s maybe, and he appeared very healthy and strong. But when the doctor checked for a pulse, there was none. And so after checking a couple more times to make sure it wasn't just a very weak pulse, the doctor ultimately concluded that, this sailor was not just unresponsive. The sailor was dead. And if Dr. Allard had to guess, he very likely died from alcohol poisoning, given his friends said, the night before, this guy had had a really heavy night of drinking, and here he was. So, alcohol poisoning. So this hospital had a policy for how to handle the death of foreign sailors in Tahiti. Basically, the doctor who pronounced the sailor dead would then arrange for them to be buried in a public cemetery. And in fact, the hospital kept these cheap wooden coffins in the hospital morgue for this exact purpose. And so Dr. Allard followed protocol and asked the police to go inform the sailor's friends of his death, and then the doctor went to the hospital's morgue to arrange for a coffin. A few hours later, Dr. Allard was back in his office when he heard a knock at his door. He told whoever it was to come in, but when the door swung open, the doctor was surprised at who he saw there. It was the 4 local gravediggers who he had called earlier to bury that sailor who had just died. Now, generally speaking, Dr. Allard had virtually no interactions with the gravediggers after he hired them. He would tell them to bury the body, and they would do that and go on their separate way. Like, there was no reason for the gravediggers to come back and check in with the doctor. But as the doctor is looking at these 4 guys, trying to figure out what was going on here, he quickly assessed that, these guys weren't here just to chat. They were here because they looked spooked. And before Dr. Allard could ask any questions about, what was going on here, one of these gravediggers began to speak. And in sort of a rapid and sort of anxious tone, he said, as we were carrying the coffin over to the gravesite, it began to shake like the person inside the coffin was alive. And then we heard all these moaning sounds coming from inside of this nailed shut coffin. And we all got so panicked that we just dropped the coffin and we ran here to tell you. Now, Dr. Allard was pretty surprised by what he was hearing, But he's also thinking that, when he hired these 4 gravediggers, they were at a local pub and they were drinking. And so he's thinking to himself, maybe something strange happened, with this coffin, or much more likely, these 4 guys are drunk. And that what they've sort of said here is just some figment of their imagination, that they're not professional, they're just drunk guys who are coming here screwing up my day. And so sort of annoyed, Dr. Allard's like, hey, I'm telling you, that guy is dead, okay? This isn't a ghost scenario, but if you're so worried about it, why don't you go get a police officer, have them come over and inspect the coffin, make sure the person is really dead in there, and then once they confirm that, please do your job and bury this guy. And so the gravediggers, they kind of, look down sort of awkwardly and they're like, okay, we'll go do that. Then they turned and they left. And then Dr. Allard got back to work. And then a few hours later, Dr. Allard heard another knock on his door. And this time when the door opened, it was a police officer. And it was actually the officer that the 4 gravediggers had gone and found at Dr. Allard's suggestion. And he had gone over, checked the coffin, and the coffin wasn't moving, it wasn't making any weird sounds, it was sealed shut, there was nothing going on. And so the officer eventually instructed the gravediggers, to go ahead and bury it, there's nothing going on here. And so the gravediggers had, at that point, buried the coffin, and that had been that. And so the officer was here just to tell Dr. Allard that, hey, it's all good, he's buried, we can move on. About a week later, Dr. Allard had basically forgotten about this whole snafu around the coffin and whatever was going on with it. He was sort of on to the next thing, and he was out like he normally was at night to go for a walk. And the area that he liked to walk in the most was actually the cemetery. Not because he had some sort of morbid obsession, but because, it was often, vacant. There was nobody there. And so it was a peaceful place to go walking. And so, he's strolling through the cemetery like usual, and he's not seeing anybody like usual. But as it began to get dark, he was walking down this one row of headstones, and he looked up ahead, and he could have sworn he saw somebody standing behind a tree with their body sort of half out of the tree, half behind the tree, sort of half obscured. And he stopped and he's looking, and the whole thing just sort of felt off. Like, what is this person doing? Is that a person? Like, what's going on here? And so he's staring, and as he's looking, sure enough, this dark silhouette steps out from behind this tree. And the way they stepped out, it was like they stepped out, turned, and faced Dr. Allard, and just stood there, clearly looking right at Dr. Allard. But they're pretty far away from Dr. Allard, like there's a good distance between them. But immediately, Dr. Allard felt threatened by this person, or whatever it was. He didn't even know if it was a person. He couldn't tell if it was his mind playing tricks on him or not. He's just staring at this thing that looked like it was looking at him. And so Dr. Allard instinctively, who's now feeling a little bit frightened, turned and just started walking away, like he was done walking in the cemetery for the night. And so he turns and he starts walking, but then it's like the hairs in the back of his neck stood up. He just felt like this person, whoever it is, they're still watching me. And so he stopped after just a couple of steps and he turned back around. And now this figure is clearly marching directly towards Dr. Allard. They're almost running. They're walking real fast right towards Dr. Allard. And so now Dr. Allard's terrified. He knows there's something happening here. Why would this person be doing this? Like, is it a person? Like, what's happening here? And so Dr. Allard, he turns and starts to run. And as he's running, he hears this horrible high-pitched scream echo across the entire cemetery. And then he looks back one last time and he sees the face of this figure, this person charging towards him. And it's the same guy who died a week ago, the same sailor that he buried, the one who presumably was moving around in the coffin the gravediggers were so scared of. It was him, and he jumped on Dr. Allard and began throttling him, and Dr. Allard's on the ground staring at this ghastly face. The scream is coming out of him. He had no idea what was going on, and then Dr. Allard just blacked out. A few minutes later, Dr. Allard came to, and he sat up suddenly, and he's looking around, and there's nobody there. It's just a dark, vacant cemetery. No sign of the dead sailor's ghost or whatever, or whoever it was. They're gone. And Dr. Allard's just sitting there, his heart's racing still, and he's telling himself, like, did that even just happen? Like, it felt so real. His neck was sore from, what he felt was this guy, this thing attacking him. But at the same time, he was so sure that the face that he had seen on this person was the dead sailor's face. But how could that be? He's dead. He's buried. How could that be? And so ultimately, Dr. Allard, he got up and he hustled back to his house. But over the coming weeks, Dr. Allard sort of spiraled into madness, because it was like every day, all the time, he would see out of the corner of his eye for a second like a glimpse of this dead sailor's ghost. And it was always that face, that ghastly face, that shrieking face looking right at him. And he'd turn and, the face would disappear. But Dr. Allard, he just felt like he was almost being haunted, that something had happened, like that attack in the cemetery. It had felt so real. He felt like now this ghost was literally haunting him. But he couldn't tell anyone. I mean, he's a doctor. What's he gonna do? Tell people that a ghost is haunting him? He didn't know what to do. And so what he ended up doing after several weeks is he just began staying home and laying in bed, basically feigning illness to avoid leaving the house. And he would just lay there with his eyes closed basically all day, because as soon as he opened his eyes, he would see this dead sailor's face. He really was losing his mind. And then eventually, when Dr. Allard knew he had to stop basically staying in bed all day and go back to the hospital and sort of function in society again, go back to work, otherwise people were gonna start asking questions here, like, what's going on with you? And he didn't have an answer, When that time came and he knew it was sort of like, okay, go back to normal or tell people about this. Well, what Dr. Allard ultimately did is he decided to walk up to the roof of his house and throw himself off. He literally couldn't live with what he believed was this ghost haunting him 24/7. When the doctor's close friends found out that the doctor had taken his own life, they immediately went to the police and said, hey, wait a minute, we think this has something to do with what he was dealing with over the past several weeks. So the doctor, despite not wanting to tell anybody about, his haunting, he did sort of begin to tell a couple of his close friends. Now, he was sort of subtle about it, but he began telling people that he's like, yeah, I keep seeing that dead sailor's face everywhere I go. I just keep seeing him. Now, he didn't highlight the fact that he was basically losing his mind over it and thought it was literally a ghost. But a couple of his close friends were aware that it almost seemed like, Dr. Allard was effectively having a mental breakdown over this dead sailor. And they did sort of connect that Dr. Allard sort of felt haunted by this dead sailor. And so, said close friends ultimately went to the police and said, hey, I know this is a stretch, but the doctor kind of thought he was being haunted by this dead sailor before he died. We think that has to do with why he took his own life. And sort of amazingly, the police, the way they responded to this was, okay, we're gonna look into this. We're gonna investigate the haunting, so to speak. And what they did is they exhumed the coffin of that dead sailor. They didn't know what else to do. They just decided they would do that. And so they raised the coffin out of the ground and they open it up and they cannot believe what they see. So it would turn out those 4 gravediggers had been totally justified in being scared about what they thought they heard and felt in that coffin when they were going to bury it. Because the sailor was not dead. He was just so drunk that it felt like he was dead. They couldn't feel his pulse. Dr. Allard had been wrong. The sailor was not dead. He was totally alive. And so as he was being carried over to the gravesite to be buried, he really was moving around inside the coffin and moaning because he was horribly hungover, but totally alive and, grappling with the fact that he's now, confined inside of this coffin. He likely had no idea what was going on, so you can imagine the types of sounds and things he might be doing. And so the gravediggers, they were right to be scared. They did get a police officer. The police officer came over, and for whatever reason, when he inspected the coffin, he saw it was sealed. There was no movement inside the coffin. It was totally quiet, so the sailor inside, he just wasn't moving or making any sound. And so the police officer greenlit burying him. So the living sailor inside the coffin is buried underground by these gravediggers, and they go their separate ways afterwards. But then that sailor wakes up again. He begins thrashing around after being buried in the ground, and he actually managed to break out of the coffin and climb out of the ground. He saved himself. He literally, survived being buried alive. But he was furious at the doctor, who so cavalierly just decided he was dead and I'll go bury him. And so he decided he would play a prank on the doctor to get back at him. So what he did is he filled his coffin up with rocks and he sealed it back up and he reburied it so nobody would know anything. And then for the next week or so, he just kind of hid out and didn't let anybody know that he was actually still alive. And then after about a week, he knew the doctor took his walks in that cemetery. And so he hid behind a tree in the cemetery and waited for the doctor to be alone making his walk. And when he saw him, It was the sailor, fully alive in the flesh, stepping out from behind the tree, looking at the doctor. That was him. It really was the sailor, and he really did run forward, shrieking, pretending to be a ghost, and he attacked Dr. Allard, basically giving him the impression that his angry ghost was attacking him. And then after Dr. Allard passed out on the ground, the sailor ran off. But for Dr. Allard, who fully believed that sailor was dead, can you imagine what he thought when he saw, the sailor attacking him and shrieking in the middle of the cemetery? He fully believed that was the sailor's ghost, and he had this totally real experience getting attacked by the ghost. And so even though he survived the encounter, it drove him mad. He began seeing the dead sailor, the ghost, everywhere he went, and it eventually drove him to kill himself. And so when the police opened up that coffin, all they saw were all the rocks the sailor had left behind. But following the doctor's suicide, that sailor apparently skipped town and was never seen again. It begins here. From the director of It comes It, Welcome to Derry, the chilling new HBO original series exploring one of horror's biggest terrors, Pennywise the Clown. Set in 1960s Derry, Maine, the new HBO original series premieres Sunday, October 26th on HBO Max. Also, you can listen to the official It, Welcome to Derry podcast wherever you get your podcasts. On the night of August 30th, 1892, a 20-year-old man named Benjamin Trudell climbed into his bed inside of the Deer Park Life-Saving Station, which was a small government building right off the coast of Lake Superior in Michigan. Benjamin was a member of the Life-Saving Service, which was a precursor to the US Coast Guard, and he was currently working overnight as a surfman, which was basically like a lifeguard, but specifically for ships that were out on the lake. He was there with a bunch of other surfmen who were all taking shifts, either sleeping, patrolling the beach, or staying awake inside the station in case somebody came looking for help. Benjamin had just finished a 4-hour beach patrol, which had been pretty uneventful, but at the same time, he was still walking around for 4 hours on loose sand, and so he was pretty tired. And so now that he was back at the station, he had a little bit of time where he could basically take a nap. And so he set his alarm for 4 hours later, which is when he would need to be awake in the station to take on another shift. And then he told his fellow surfmen that he was gonna close his eyes for a minute. And then he climbed into bed and fell asleep. A few hours later, though, Ben shot up in bed and began frantically looking around the room. He was covered in sweat, his heart was racing, and after a second, he realized that, he's okay. He's in the station, he's safe, and what had just happened to him was just a dream. He had had a terrifying nightmare, but it had felt so real that it really took him a second to, understand that that's all it had been, just a dream. In this dream, Benjamin was walking along the coast of Lake Superior, like he did during his nightly beach patrol, and it was dark out and there was this awful thunderstorm, and the rain was coming down so hard that Benjamin could barely see, and in fact, he almost felt like the impacts of the individual raindrops almost hurt his skin, like they were acid striking his skin. Then suddenly, through this wall of rain right in front of him, this man who Ben didn't recognize kind of stumbled into view. And this man was wearing very nice clothing, like he was on his way to a party or something. But, they're down at the coast of this lake, and it's storming out, it didn't make any sense. But Benjamin, he just stared at the sky and didn't say anything. And the guy looked right back at Benjamin, and without saying a word, he just reached out and really aggressively shook Benjamin's hand. And then, as Benjamin is watching his hand be shaken around by this guy with wild eyes turns and he points out to the lake that's right next to them. And even though he didn't say anything, he pointed with this level of urgency, like there's something out there, something bad, and you need to pay attention to whatever it is. And so Benjamin, he turned, and his hand's still being shaken by this guy, and he looks out, but it's just a wall of water. He can't even see the lake, and he has no idea what this guy is trying to tell him. And it was at that point that, Benjamin sat up and he was awake again. Now, objectively, Benjamin understood that while this dream definitely was creepy, it wasn't really terrifying. It was raining and storming, and a random guy came up and shook his hand and pointed at the lake. That's not terrifying. But for some reason for Benjamin, it just felt so real that was the thing that made it so unsettling. It felt like he really had been out there and really had this interaction. Now, Benjamin was not the type of guy that would, find meaning in dreams. He basically chalked dreams up as just that, just dreams. But there was something different about this dream. He felt almost intuitively like what had just happened in his dream was a warning that man, whoever he was telling Benjamin something, and it had to do with the lake, but he didn't know what it was. But as Benjamin thought about this, he knew how sort of crazy that sounded, and he figured that maybe he was just kind of caught up in the immediacy of having just had this dream, that really the only reason he felt like it had weight is because it just happened. And so maybe if he just went outside and got some fresh air and let some time pass, that he would, let this dream fade into the ether and he'd go back to normal life. And sure enough, when he got outside and got some fresh air, he did feel better, but he did still feel like that dream meant something. And so he just walked down to the coast of Lake Superior, where he was in his dream, to the other surfmen who were down there doing their own patrol. And there, there was nothing unusual happening. The lake, it was so calm. And Benjamin, he went up to one of the surfmen and just kind of told them about this dream, and he was almost joking about it. He's like, yeah, it felt so real that I almost feel like it was a warning of some kind, but yeah, it's just a dream. And the other surfmen who were listening just were like, yeah, that's crazy dream, huh? And that was it. The following day, around noon, Benjamin and his fellow surfmen were hanging out inside the life-saving station when all of a sudden, this guy comes stumbling into the station, and he looked awful. He was soaking wet, he was covered in all these cuts and bruises, and he was visibly shaking so much that it almost looked like he was about to collapse right there onto the floor. Benjamin immediately asked the guy, hey, what's going on? What's brought you here? What's happening? And the man, who clearly was struggling to just breathe at this point, sort of composed himself and just said, I was out on the lake last night on a ship that sunk. And as soon as he said that, Benjamin was in total disbelief, because if a ship sunk on Lake Superior, the life-saving service that Benjamin was a part of was supposed to know, because they patrolled the lake and tracked the vessels out on the water. So it seems sort of impossible that a ship could sink and his crew, the surfmen, would somehow not even know about it. And then, at the same time Benjamin is thinking this, he couldn't help but go back to that dream he had had. It had happened last night, and it just seemed like this guy was warning Benjamin about something out on the lake. It just seemed way too coincidental that this guy's here the next day talking about a shipwreck out on the lake around the same time frame. The survivor of this shipwreck explained that the ship had been really far out on the lake, probably too far away from shore for them to even see. And he said that he and several other people had made it onto a lifeboat, but the boat had capsized. And he had spent hours and hours swimming to shore, and he had just gotten here, and that's why he'd come in, and he was soaking wet and so tired because he had just swam all night. And he said he didn't know about any of the other survivors or if there were any other survivors. All he knew is that he was here and he has no idea what else happened. And so Benjamin and the other surfmen immediately gave this man a blanket and some food and some water, and then they quickly sent out a fleet of boats to go search the lake to hopefully find other victims of the shipwreck. That evening and all through the night, Benjamin and his co-workers sailed rescue boats back and forth all across Lake Superior looking for survivors, but all they could find were 4 dead bodies. But the man who had swam to shore and told them about this shipwreck said there had to be more people out there. He said there had been 27 people on this ship, including him, when it had sunk, which meant a lot of people were still definitely unaccounted for. So while some of the surfmen continued to search out on the water, Benjamin and a small team decided they would actually search the coastline itself and see if anybody washed up on shore. And so early on the morning of September 1st, so now the surfmen have been out searching for people for over 24 hours at this point, Benjamin and his team were walking down the coastline, and they looked up ahead and they saw what appeared to be 2 people laying on the sand. And so of course they ran up to them, and unfortunately they discovered that, it was a man and a woman who were lying face down in the sand, and they were not breathing. They were dead. And so Ben, he knelt down next to the man and he began rolling his body over to get a look at him. And when he did that, 2 things happened. When he rolled him over and actually got a look at this guy's face, he he saw immediately that it was the exact same guy from his dream. The guy who had shaken his hand and pointed out at the lake. It was him, definitely. And as he's having this revelation and he's sort of kneeling there in shock, the man's body, he's sort of rolling it over, and as it completes the rollover, the man's limp hand falls directly onto Ben's hand, like a handshake. Ben would later learn that the ship that sunk out on Lake Superior the night before was called the Western Reserve, and apparently it had sunk during the exact same time that Ben had that nightmare. And the man that Ben saw in his dream, the man that had been pointing out at the lake and shaking his hand in the dream, and then Ben found on the shore dead, who then in his death flopped over and put his hand in his hand all over again, was a guy named Robert Minch, and he was part owner of the Western Reserve ship. For the rest of Benjamin's life, he believed that Robert's spirit had actually visited him in that nightmare to warn him about the shipwreck that was literally happening right then and there. That he was shaking his hand and pointing out at the lake like, hey, go out there right now. There's something horrible happening. A ship is sinking. People need your help. But when Benjamin woke up, despite really feeling like this meant something, this dream was a warning, he didn't actually go out and search the lake. And so as a result, the ship sank. In fact, of the 27 people who were on board that ship that sank, 26 died, including Robert, the owner. The only survivor was that man who swam to shore and told them after the shipwreck had already happened. On the afternoon of September 20th, 1989, a 70-year-old man named Jim Moore and his wife Clara walked along the beach on a tiny island off the coast of South Carolina. It was called Pawleys Island, and it was less than 4 miles long and only wide enough to fit one main road with beachfront houses on either side. Jim and Clara lived in one of those beachfront houses, and every afternoon they would go out and walk the beach together. That particular day, as they walked, Jim could see some clouds gathering off in the distance, right above the ocean. And he'd actually seen a weather report recently about this big storm called Hurricane Hugo that was supposed to be heading their way in the next couple of days. Living on an island, Jim and Clara were pretty used to getting warnings like that. I mean, storms were sort of a big deal on an island because you're pretty isolated. And they were just planning to evacuate if the weather, got pretty bad. But for now, it did seem like the weather wasn't too bad, so they were sticking it out. However, it did sort of seem like basically everybody else on Pawleys Island had taken the storm a little bit more seriously, and most of them had already evacuated. And in fact, as Jim and Clara are walking, normally they would see lots of people out doing what they were doing, walking the beach, but today, there was just one person really far down the beach, just this one guy walking towards them, but that was it. The rest of the beach was basically deserted. But Jim and Clara were, veterans of Pawleys Island and certainly veterans of other storms that they had weathered in the past, and so they weren't worried yet. And they just continued to, walk down the beach and chat and just kind of stare out at these growing clouds and just have a normal day. But as they're walking, Jim was sort of keeping an eye on this guy, this one other guy on the beach that was walking towards them. Now, he wasn't literally walking towards them, he was just sort of walking in the other direction. And so inevitably, both Jim and Clara and this guy were going to pass each other, and as Jim got closer to this guy, he realized he actually didn't recognize him. And realistically, Pawleys Island was so small that Jim and Clara basically knew everybody, or at least could recognize everybody. But this guy, who was wearing this long gray coat and this wide-brimmed hat, and he kind of had his head down, Jim didn't recognize. And he told Clara, hey, who is this guy? As they're walking closer and closer, and she's like, I don't know, I've never seen him before. But, there was no cause for alarm here. It's broad daylight, and who cares if there's a stranger on the island? Of course, people that live here have guests all the time. This is probably just somebody visiting somebody who lives here. And so they're walking, getting closer and closer. And then finally, when Jim and Clara were about, 10 feet away from this guy, the guy in the big gray coat, Jim, to be polite, just said, hey, how you doing? Because they're the only people on the beach. You can't just ignore each other. But the guy in the gray coat, he just kept that big hat sort of angled down and just briskly walked right past Jim and Clara and didn't even acknowledge them, which is there's nobody else here. What are you doing? It's sort of rude. And so Jim and Clara, they look at each other like, that's weird. They keep on walking. And then for whatever reason, Jim just turns around and looks towards the sky, the guy who had just passed them, the guy in the gray coat. And when he looked, he just stopped because the guy was gone and there's nowhere to go. There is no, shrubs or trees or anything. This is a wide open, flat beach. And this guy has just passed Jim and Clara like seconds ago. He can't be anywhere else. He has to be on the beach. There's nowhere to hide. And so Jimmy grabs Clara and he's like, look, he's gone. And she turns around and she's like, what's going on? That's not possible. And they're looking like, did he go in the ocean? But they're looking out in the water and there's no sign of him. The only place, maybe he could have gone is if as soon as he passed by Jim and Clara, he hard turned and ran inland and hid, behind one of the houses. But that's pretty far away. It just didn't seem possible that in that short of an amount of time, he could get up there and hide. And also, why would you do that? That's such bizarre behavior. And so Jim and Clara, they're just standing there like trying to come up with some reasonable theory to explain where this guy went, but they just couldn't do it. It was like this guy just disappeared. And so eventually, Jim and Clara just had to turn back around and finish their walk and make their way home. And the whole time, all they could talk about was this disappearing man in the gray coat, because it defied any rational explanation. Where did he go? When the couple finally got back to their house, by this point, the clouds that had been gathering outside were now very dark, and it really did seem like a serious storm was on the horizon. And then when they turned on the TV, they put on the Weather Channel, and there was this bulletin that the South Carolina state government had actually issued an evacuation order to all inhabitants of Pawleys Island, because apparently Hurricane Hugo was getting bigger and faster and more destructive, and it appeared like Pawleys Island was clearly going to be in the path of this hurricane. And so at this point, Jim and Clara forgot about the gray man and realized like, hey, we got to pack our stuff up and go. We thought we had maybe a day or two before we'd have to evacuate, but no more. We got to go right now. And fortunately for them, they actually had an adult daughter who lived right on mainland South Carolina. And so they could stay with her on short notice, no problem. And so they quickly packed up, they hopped in their car, and they drove on the one main road until they hit the bridge that went over the ocean. They made their way across the bridge onto mainland South Carolina and over to their daughter's house. And once they got there, their daughter was obviously very happy to see them, happy they were safe. And they would just spend the whole day basically just sitting there with the Weather Channel on, watching reports about Hurricane Hugo. And over the course of the day, the news got more and more dire. Hurricane Hugo was poised to be this enormous, destructive storm that was not slowing down at all. And unfortunately, Pawleys Island was really looking like one of the main areas that was going to be affected by this storm. In fact, the meteorologist was saying, like, it is not safe to be on the island at this point. I mean, there's a chance that all the structures on the island could be leveled by the end of this storm. So Jim and Clara, they're obviously happy they are safe, on mainland South Carolina with their daughter, but they live on that island. Their house, everything they own, it's on that island. And so the idea that they were just helpless and their house is going to be destroyed was sort of just terrible. Like, what can you even do? You're helpless. And so as they began to sort of spiral into all their anxieties around what's going to happen, eventually one of them said, hey, let's just accept that we're in this position and let's just change the subject. We're safe here. Don't worry about what the storm's gonna do. Let's just change the subject. And the first subject that was raised was Jim and Clara's encounter with that strange disappearing man in the gray cloak. And so Jim and Clara, they told the story to their daughter about this weird guy they saw and how he just kind of vanished. And their daughter was like really interested listening to the story. And when they were done telling it, she looked at her parents and was like, I think you might have seen the gray man. Now, Jim and Clara had lived on Pawleys Island long enough to know about the legend of the gray man. As the story goes, 150 years earlier, there was this sailor who was making his way to Pawleys Island to see his fiancée who was there. And when he got to the island, he unfortunately basically fell into quicksand and died. And so the fiancée is totally heartbroken. She's basically losing her mind over the sudden loss of her love. But a couple of days after her fiancé, the sailor, had died, she saw him walking on the beach on Pawleys Island. And he was wearing this long gray coat and this big wide-brimmed hat. And he was walking towards her and she was so overjoyed. She knows it doesn't make any sense, but she runs to her beloved sailor. And right as she reaches him, he disappears. Now, Jim and Clara, they couldn't help but see the overlap here. I mean, they saw, a guy wearing a long gray coat with a big wide-brimmed hat who, was walking on the beach, who then disappeared. It did sort of seem like the legend of the Gray Man, but neither Jim nor Clara really felt like that actually was the explanation here. But at the same time, Jim did feel like, man, that is a weird coincidence. Over the next couple of days, Hurricane Hugo made landfall, and it was absolutely vicious. And then finally, when it passed and it was safe to go back to Pawleys Island, Jim and Clara loaded up their car, they said bye to their daughter, and they made the drive out there. And as they were crossing the bridge to get out to Pawleys Island, along with all the other inhabitants that were going back, they immediately could tell that Pawleys Island really had been leveled. I mean, the roads themselves were badly damaged, there were street signs and trees everywhere, and as they're getting closer, they can see that basically their whole community has been leveled. All the buildings are destroyed. I mean, it's like a war zone. Now, Jim and Clara had sort of braced themselves for this because they had heard on the news that sure enough, this hurricane had been as bad as expected and Pawleys Island had taken a direct hit. And so they drove across the island until they reached their property. And when they got to their property, they could not believe what they saw. So there's actually one more part to the legend of the Gray Man ghost. And that is when the woman saw who she believed was her dead fiance walking up the beach with his gray coat and his big brimmed hat, and she runs up and he disappears and it's so tragic. That's not the end of the story, because the woman was so upset by seeing what she thought was her fiance again. He's back from the dead, oh my goodness, and then he vanishes. It's like she had to experience his death a second time, and it made her go crazy. It was like so much grief. It was so overwhelming that she couldn't live with it. And in fact, quickly after seeing, his ghost disappear, she was sent off the island to a hospital. She was basically institutionalized. And while she was off the island, immediately after she left the island, this huge storm rolled through and leveled Pawleys Island. And only one building survived. It was her house. Inexplicably, her house was untouched, completely untouched. Everybody else's ruined. So keep that in mind, because when Jim and Clara returned to Pawleys Island following Hurricane Hugo, whose house was the only house left standing? Theirs. Utterly untouched. Their neighbors' houses, all the local businesses, everything gone. Their house, untouched. And just so you know, the legend of the Gray Man, people believe if you see the Gray Man, he's warning you to leave the island in advance of a storm, like he apparently did for his fiance. He warned her, get off the island. And if you heed his warning, the legend goes, your house will be spared. And people believe that's exactly what happened to Jim and Clara. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.